She walked into that throne room with her head high and a knife behind her teeth, because the court had decided she was already dead. They said the king had taken a new woman. They said Evelina's days inside that palace were numbered. They were wrong. But they were also right about one thing. This was never about a lover. This was about a throne, and the woman who sat on it. Watch until the last second, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about power. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see where the tribe is watching from tonight. The Imperial Assembly Hall of Caldenmore had been built 3 centuries ago by a king who feared nothing except silence. He had ordered the ceilings raised to 40 feet, the pillars carved from black granite hauled down from the Ashvale Mountains, and the marble floor laid in a pattern of concentric rings so that every man who walked toward the throne felt the room watching him shrink. Torchlight ran along iron sconces bolted to the walls, and even in the hour before noon, with gray autumn light pressing through the high-arched windows, the hall ate shadows. It was a room designed to make people feel small. Queen Evelina Rowan had never once felt small inside it. She felt it now. Not the smallness, she would not allow that, not yet, but something close to it, a pressure behind the sternum, like a fist closing slow around the bones of her chest. She stood at the head of the queen's entry corridor, the carved oak doors not yet opened before her, and she breathed, in, out. The air tasted of beeswax and stone dust, and the particular cold that settled into old buildings when the season turned. Her handmaid, Dora, stood 2 steps behind her with a face like a woman walking to a hanging. Dora was 53 years old, had served Evelina since before the marriage, and had never once in 15 years failed to hold her composure. She was holding it now by the skin of her teeth. Evelina could see it in the set of the woman's jaw, the way her hands had gone flat against her sides instead of folded at her waist the way they usually were. "You don't have to say it," Evelina told her. "I wasn't going to say anything, Your Majesty." "You were thinking it loud enough to hear." Dora said nothing, which was saying something. Evelina looked down at her own hands. She had dressed herself this morning without assistance, which she had not done in years. She had wanted the time alone. She had needed to feel the weight of every clasp and button without someone else managing it for her, because she had known since the courier arrived 3 nights ago with the sealed note, that today was the kind of day a woman needed to put on her own armor. The gown was deep cobalt blue, heavy silk velvet, the kind of fabric that did not move when you walked but draped with its own authority. The bodice was stitched in silver thread, a pattern of interlocking rings that her mother had designed for her coronation and that every court in the known empire recognized as the queen's mark. Her hair was up. Her neck was bare except for a single chain of hammered gold that had been a wedding gift from Rowan, worn deliberately, worn as a message, because messages were sometimes the only weapons a woman was allowed to carry into a room. She had no documents with her. No ledger, no letter, no evidence folded into a pocket. Everything she needed was in her memory. She had spent 2 days reading those financial records until the columns of numbers had burned themselves behind her eyelids, until she could recite figures and dates and the names of the men who had moved imperial treasury funds through 3 shadow accounts into the coffers of a Valdris merchant house with known ties to the eastern border lords. She did not need paper. Paper could be seized. Paper could be denied. What lived inside her skull was hers alone. "Your Majesty." Dora again, softer this time. "The ministers will be seated already." "I know." "Commander Verath sent word this morning that the eastern wing corridor is clear, that the alternate route to the king's study is—" "I'm not going through the study." Evelina turned to look at her handmaid directly. "I am walking through the front doors." Dora held her gaze. There was something in the old woman's eyes that was not quite fear and not quite grief and not quite pride. Some combination of all 3 that only came to faces that had watched someone they loved choose the harder path. "Yes, Your Majesty," she said. Evelina faced the doors. "Open them." The 2 imperial guards posted at the entry hauled the oak doors inward, and the sound of the assembly hall hit her like a physical thing. Voices, the scrape of chair legs on marble, the clink of decorative armor on the generals seated in the rear gallery, the low, persistent murmur of 100 conversations being held in the kind of undertone that meant every single person in that room had already been talking about her before she walked in. She walked in. The hall was full. That was the first thing she registered. Not just the ministers and generals who were required to attend Imperial Assembly, but the attached gallery on the upper level was packed with noble observers, the kind of attendance that only happened when word had gotten out that something worth watching was about to occur. Someone had told them. Someone had made sure the seats were filled, because a performance required an audience, and what was happening today was undeniably a performance. The second thing she registered was Seraphine. The king's stepmother sat in the high advisory chair to the left of the throne. Not the throne itself, never the throne, but close enough. Lady Seraphine Caldenvoss had been born the daughter of a Marfield wool merchant and had married the old king, Aldrich Rowan, in his 58th year, a union that had surprised every courtier in Caldenmore and satisfied none of them. Aldrich had died 11 years ago. Seraphine had remained. She was 61 now and looked 50, which she had achieved through the kind of ruthless maintenance that required both vanity and discipline. And Evelina had long ago stopped underestimating what that combination could produce in a human being. Seraphine's gown today was ivory and gold. She wore the Rowan House colors. She had no right to the Rowan House colors. Their eyes met across 30 feet of black marble. Seraphine smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that didn't need to be large to do its work, and it hit Evelina somewhere below the ribcage like a stone dropped into still water. She knew. She knew before Evelina had said a word, and the smile said so. Evelina kept walking. She reached her chair. Not the throne, the queen's seat, positioned to the right of the throne, and set one step below it on the dais, and sat. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the chamber before her, at the rows of ministers in their formal coats, the military men in the rear gallery, the nobles leaning forward on the upper balcony with the particular hunger that wealthy people carried for other people's disasters. The throne was empty. King Rowan had not yet arrived. That was the third thing she had noted, and it hit with the weight it deserved. The assembly herald raised his iron staff and struck the floor 3 times. The Imperial Assembly of Caldenmore is now in session. Ministers, you may be seated. The rustling settled. The murmur dropped to nothing. Evelina sat in the quiet and breathed and waited. She had requested this session herself. That was the trap she had walked toward with her eyes open. 6 days ago, when the rumors had first become too loud to ignore, when she had heard from 3 separate sources that the king had taken a woman into his private apartments on the East Wing, a young woman no one had seen before, a woman who had apparently arrived in the palace under circumstances that no one seemed willing to explain, Evelina had done what she always did. She had gone very still. She had listened, and then she had begun to move. She had filed a formal request for Imperial Assembly on the grounds of a matter of court integrity, which was language deliberately vague enough to mean anything and specific enough to require an answer. The assembly had been granted for the 14th day of the month, which was today. She had spent the days between then and now collecting information, and what she had found had shifted the entire shape of what she believed she was walking into. It was no longer a matter of her husband's faithlessness. She had made her peace with that possibility years ago, or thought she had, and it was a different kind of pain than she was prepared to describe even to herself, but it was not the thing that mattered here. What mattered was the pattern. What mattered was the money, and the ministers, and the shadow accounts, and the name of the Valdres merchant house that appeared once in an imperial treasury ledger, and once again in a document recovered from the personal correspondence of a man who had died under circumstances that had been called an accident, and that Evelina did not believe was an accident. What she had found was a conspiracy, and what she intended to do today was name it. The doors at the far end of the hall opened. King Alpha Rowan entered. I was 38 years old and carried his height, like a man who had never learned to stop expecting the world to make room for him, which it always had. He was not a cruel man. Evelina had married him knowing his flaws, and had never counted cruelty among them. He was proud, and he was stubborn, and he was capable of extraordinary blindness when it came to people he had decided to trust. His dark hair was combed back from his face, and he wore the gray formal coat with the silver epaulets that he reserved for assembly sessions. And he looked, as he always looked when he walked into a room full of people waiting for him, like a man who had already decided nothing in this room could touch him. He reached the dais and sat on the throne without looking at her. Evelina watched him settle. She watched the way his eyes swept the room. Not her, not yet. Taking in the gallery, the ministers, the generals in the back. He had his public face on, which was a slightly flattened version of his real one. She knew every version of his face. She had spent 12 years learning them. The herald struck the floor again. His Imperial Majesty, King Alpha Rowan. Her Imperial Majesty, Queen Evelina Rowan. The assembly is in full session. Rowan turned to her then. A brief glance, the kind that contained nothing you could use. My queen. My king. Her voice came out level. Good. He looked away. Toward the ministers. The session was called at the Queen's request, the herald announced. Her Majesty holds the first address. Evelina stood. The room went absolutely still. She had that effect sometimes, when she wanted to, and she wanted to now. She was tall for a woman of her time, and she had learned long ago that height was not about bones. It was about the decision to occupy space without apologizing for it. She stood, and she looked out at the rows of ministers, and she began to speak. Gentlemen, she said, we have before us a matter that concerns the integrity of the imperial court. I have in recent days become aware of several questions that require answers. Questions about the movement of funds through the imperial treasury in the second and third quarters of this year. Questions about certain financial agreements that appear to have been made without imperial authorization or public record. She paused. And questions about the presence of an individual inside this palace whose origins and purpose have not been formally disclosed to the court. The murmur started low and spread fast. She let it run for 2 seconds and then continued over it. I raise these matters not out of personal grievance, but out of obligation to this institution and to this empire. The law of Caldenmore is clear on the matter of undisclosed financial agreements entered into by officers of the... Your Majesty. The voice was not a minister's. It was not the herald's. It was not Rowan's. Seraphine had risen from her chair. Evelina stopped, not because she had to, but because what had just happened was extraordinary enough to require acknowledgement. Lady Seraphine Caldenvoss, who held an advisory position at court that carried the right to speak during open deliberation, but that no one in living memory had seen exercised, had stood up in the middle of the Queen's formal address and opened her mouth. The murmur in the room doubled. Rowan's head turned toward his stepmother with an expression that Evelina could not immediately read. Seraphine stood with a calm that was something close to magnificent. Her hands were clasped before her. Her ivory and gold gown caught the torchlight. Her face held the expression of a woman who had decided she was in the right and had arrived at that conclusion long enough ago that the certainty had calcified into something that looked almost like serenity. Forgive the interruption, Seraphine said. She did not sound like she was asking forgiveness. She sounded like she was offering it, which was a different thing entirely. But I believe I must speak to the nature of this address before it proceeds further. What Her Majesty is raising is not, as she has framed it, a matter of treasury irregularity. She let that settle for half a second. It is a matter of personal grievance, and it would be a disservice to this court to allow it to be dressed in the language of institutional concern. Evelina said, You are out of order, Lady Seraphine. The advisory charter grants me right of floor during open deliberation, Your Majesty, as I believe you know. She did know. That was the blade of it. Sit down, Evelina said. Her voice was still level. She was making a deliberate choice to keep it level. The moment she raised it, she was doing exactly what Seraphine wanted her to do. I will sit when I have said what needs saying. Seraphine turned from Evelina and addressed the hall at large, which was the move of someone who had decided that the exchange between two women was already settled, and that the room's opinion was the only thing left worth managing. Ministers, generals, my lords in the gallery. Her voice carried without effort, the voice of a woman who had spent 60 years making herself heard in rooms that had not been designed for her. Her Majesty the Queen has requested this assembly under the pretense of financial oversight. What she intends is to attack the reputation of a young woman who has done nothing more than find herself in an unfortunate position through no choice of her own. That is not, Evelina started. The young woman in question, Seraphine continued, loudly enough to run over the Queen's voice without sounding like she was running over it, which was a technique of extraordinary refinement, is Lyra Vale, a woman of no title and no means who came to this court under circumstances that are, I grant, unusual, but whose presence here is the result of a debt of gratitude owed by this house. She turned back toward the throne, and her eyes went to Rowan. A debt that His Majesty has chosen to honor privately, and that Her Majesty has chosen to interpret as something it is not. The hall erupted. Not loudly. This was an assembly, not a marketplace, but in the way that closed rooms erupt, in the 100 small sounds of people turning to the person beside them, in the sharp intake of breath from the gallery above, in the way the sound of the room changed texture entirely, from murmur to something that had edges. Evelina stood in the middle of it and felt the pressure behind her sternum transform into something colder and more focused. She had prepared for Seraphine opposing her. She had not prepared for Seraphine doing it here, publicly, in front of the full assembly, in the first 30 seconds of her address, before she had gotten within 10 sentences of the financial evidence. That was not a defensive move. That was an opening assault. She looked at Rowan. I was looking at Seraphine. His jaw was set. He had the expression he wore when he was processing something he had not expected and was deciding how to respond to it, and the fact that he had not yet spoken, had not told his stepmother to sit down, had not looked at Evelina, had not done anything at all, was the loudest thing in the room. "My king," Evelina said. He looked at her. That flattened public face. Nothing in it she could grip. "Do you intend to allow this interruption to continue?" A pause. Not a long one, but long enough. "Lady Seraphine holds advisory right of floor," he said, as she stated. Evelina heard it land in the room. She saw the minister in the second row, Arneth Kavos, who had been a reliable ally since the first year of the reign, look down at his hands. She saw the general in the rear gallery, old Fereth Dunmore, lean to say something to the man beside him. She saw the nobles in the upper gallery lean forward in unison with the particular attentiveness of people who had come hoping for something and were now receiving it. She sat down. Not because she had lost. She had not lost. Not yet. Not even close. But because she was not going to stand and argue with a woman who had the king's silence as her backing, and she was not going to give the gallery the image of a queen standing in undignified opposition to a court elder. She sat, and she folded her hands, and she looked at Seraphine with a face that gave away nothing. Seraphine had taken her seat as well, which meant she had gotten what she came for in the first exchange. She settled back into her chair with the ease of a woman in a room she had already decided belonged to her. The herald, after a moment of apparent paralysis, struck the floor. The floors returned to Lady Seraphine Caldenvos under advisory charter. Seraphine rose again smoothly. "Thank you." She addressed the hall. "I will not speak at length. What I have to say is simple." She paused, and in that pause Evelina noticed something. Seraphine was not looking at her. She was looking at the ministers, moving her gaze from face to face in the deliberate pattern of a woman who had studied each one and knew what each one needed to see. His Majesty the King is a man who has served this empire for 12 years with dedication and sacrifice that I believe this court sometimes forgets. In the second year of his reign, there was an attempt on his life. Most of you know of it. Few of you know the full circumstances. She let that breathe. The attempt was stopped. It was stopped by an act of courage from a young woman who was at that time working within the household of a border lord who was, himself, party to the conspiracy. She warned the king's outriders. She gave specific information that allowed the assassination route to be disrupted. She did this at considerable personal risk. Seraphine's voice had dropped slightly, which made it carry further, which was not an accident. Her name is Lyra Vale. What she asked in return for that service was nothing. She asked only to be left alone. His Majesty chose, after all these years, to honor that service more formally, to bring her to the capital, to offer her a position within the palace household. She looked at the throne briefly. A decision made in private by a king who is allowed to make private decisions. Then finally she looked at Evelina. Whatever Her Majesty has interpreted from that decision, I assure this court it is not what she believes. The silence that followed was the worst silence Evelina had sat inside in 12 years of court life. It was the silence of a room that was deciding, rapidly and collectively, what to do with what it had just heard. It was the silence before a tide turned. She needed to speak. She needed to speak right now, before the tide finished turning, before the ministers in the second and third rows, who were looking at each other instead of at the throne, finished whatever calculation they were running in their heads, before the gallery above made up its minds, and the whispers started flowing downward with the particular momentum of rumors that had been given a respectable shape. She stood. What Lady Seraphine has described, Evelina said, is a story I was not aware of. She kept her voice even. Not warm, not cold, factual. The voice of a woman who is talking about evidence, not feelings. I would be interested in the documentation that supports it. She looked at Seraphine. The date of the assassination attempt, the border lord's name, the report filed with the king's security detail at the time. A pause. Surely these records exist. Seraphine did not blink. Some matters concerning the king's security are handled outside of formal record for reasons that I imagine Her Majesty can appreciate. Convenient, Evelina said. Prudent, Seraphine replied. I am also, Evelina continued, turning to face the wider hall, still waiting for an explanation of the financial records I mentioned before I was interrupted. The movement of funds through 3 separate accounts between the months of Ash Month and Coldfall. The name Valdris House, which appears in those records. The connection between Valdris House and the eastern border territories. She let that land. These are not matters of personal grievance. These are numbers on paper. I will present them to any minister in this hall who wishes to examine them. Movement in the second row. Arneth Kavos, finally looking up. She caught his eye and held it. He looked away. Back to his hands. Something contracted in her chest. Arneth Kavos, who had attended her wedding, who had voted for the water rights reform she had spent 3 years building, who had told her, just 4 months ago, over wine in the minister's antechamber, that she was the finest administrative mind to sit beside a Calden throne in a generation. He looked away. The matter of treasury records, said another voice. Minister Dolvain, from the 4th row, a small man with a neat beard, and the eyes of someone who had survived 4 monarchs by always standing slightly behind whoever was currently winning, is perhaps better addressed in closed session rather than open assembly. There are sensitivities around financial disclosure that closed session, Evelina said flatly, is where things disappear. She heard her own voice, and she heard the edge in it, and she made the decision to leave the edge there. I am requesting open examination of these records before this full assembly. If there is nothing to hide, that should be a simple thing to grant, murmuring. The gallery above was leaning forward in near unison now. Rowan spoke. The matter of treasury records will be reviewed through proper channel. His voice was quiet and absolute in the way of men who have never had to shout to be obeyed. As Minister Dolvain noted, open assembly is not the appropriate forum. Then when, through proper channel, Rowan repeated, the Queen's concerns are noted. The Queen's concerns are noted. Evelina stood very still. She was aware of her own heartbeat. Not racing, not yet, but present in a way it usually was not. The body doing what bodies did when they understood before the mind did, that something fundamental had shifted. The king had just patted her on the head in front of a full court. He had not contradicted Seraphine. He had not explained Lyra Vale. He had not looked at his wife with anything approaching alliance. He had handled her. She sat down. She did not allow her face to show what was happening behind it. She sat, and she looked at the middle distance, and she breathed, in, out, and she thought about what she knew and what it meant and what she was going to do about it. What she knew, the financial records were real. She had seen them, had held them in her hands, had traced the numbers herself. The money was real. The accounts were real. The name Valdris was real. These things did not become unreal because Arneth Kavos had looked at his hands, or because the king had said through proper channel in his flattest voice what it meant. Seraphine had known she was coming, had known the shape of her address, or enough of it, had prepared a counter-narrative in advance, had prepared it well enough that she could deploy it in the first 30 seconds of the session without hesitation or visible improvisation. That level of preparation did not come from instinct. It came from intelligence. Someone had told Seraphine what Evelina intended to say. Someone inside the Queen's household, or inside the network of people who had helped her gather the records. She thought about Commander Verath, who had sent word this morning about the cleared corridor and the alternate route. She thought about the 2 days she had spent in the records room with a single lamp and her handmaid outside the door and the documents spread across the table before her. She thought about who else had been in that building, whose footsteps she might have heard and dismissed, whose face she might have seen in the corridor and not registered. And she thought about Lyra Vale, who was somewhere in this palace right now, whose name had just been spoken in front of 100 people by the king's stepmother, who had been described as a woman of no title and no means who had saved a king's life, and whose presence here was, according to Seraphine, entirely innocent. Lyra Vale, whose name Evelina had found once, very briefly, in a letter tucked inside a folder of financial correspondence that had no obvious reason to contain a personal letter at all. The assembly continued. Other business was raised and disposed of. Ministers spoke. Reports were given. Evelina sat through it with her hands in her lap and her face composed and her mind running at a speed that she was careful not to let show on her body. She had learned, over 12 years in this court, that the most dangerous thing a person in her position could do was look like they were thinking. People read thought as calculation, and calculation as threat, and threat as guilt, and the sequence from guilt to punishment was depressingly short when the people doing the reading had decided in advance what they wanted to find. When the session ended and the herald struck the floor for dismissal, she did not move immediately. She let the ministers rise first. She sat and watched them file past, and she watched who met her eyes and who did not, and she was building the map of it even as the room emptied around her. Arneth Kavos left without looking in her direction. Dolvan left quickly, glancing toward Seraphine's chair as he went. 3 others from the middle rows left together, speaking in low voices, which meant they were comparing notes, which meant they had notes to compare, which meant they had already been talking about this before today. Seraphine remained in her chair until most of the room was empty. Then she rose with unhurried grace and looked at Evelina across the cleared marble floor, and the look held everything it needed to hold without requiring a single word. It was the look of a move played well. It was the look of an opening gambit that had landed exactly where it was aimed. It was the look of a woman who had been waiting a long time for this day and had decided the wait was over. Then she walked out. Evelina sat alone in the assembly hall for 3 minutes. She counted them. She needed 3 minutes before she trusted her legs to carry her out without any visible tremor in them, because what she had just sat through had cost something, and she would not spend what remained of this day looking like it had. She stood. She smoothed the front of her cobalt gown. She walked toward the door. Dora was waiting in the corridor. One look at the handmaid's face, and Evelina knew the woman had heard everything through the heavy door, or enough of it. "Don't," Evelina said. I know what your face is doing." Dora closed her mouth and fell into step beside her. They walked. The corridor was long and cold, and the sound of their footsteps ran ahead of them on the stone. "Verath?" Evelina said quietly. "Your Majesty?" "Find Commander Verath. Tell him I need to speak with him tonight, after the 7th bell, after the night guard rotation. The garden alcove, not the study. The garden alcove." She paused. "Tell him in person, not by courier." "Yes, Your Majesty." Another pause. Longer. They turned a corner, and the light changed. Dimmer here, the afternoon pressing cold through a narrow window. "The letter," Evelina said. "The one I found in the Valdris folder. The one with Lyra Vale's name. I remember it." The handwriting on the outside was not the same as the handwriting on the inside. Dora was quiet for a moment. "You noticed that?" "I notice everything." She had not thought about it since, had filed it as potentially significant, had intended to return to it, had been running too many threads at once. But now, in the context of what had just happened in the assembly hall, in the context of Seraphine standing up with a prepared story about assassination attempts and heroic young women, the detail of 2 different handwritings on a letter found inside a financial folder had moved from potentially significant to urgent. "I need to see that letter again. It is in the records room. Tonight, after Verath." "Yes, Your Majesty." Dora hesitated. 1 step, 2. "Your Majesty." Seraphine's claim, about the assassination attempt, about what the girl did. "It may be partially true," Evelina said. "The best lies are." "Do you think the king "The king," Evelina said carefully, did not contradict her. They walked on. The thing about being cornered. And she had been cornered today. She would not lie to herself about that. She had walked into the assembly hall intending to begin dismantling a conspiracy and had been publicly reframed as a jealous wife before she had finished her second sentence. The thing about being cornered was that the walls only held you if you decided they did. A corner was a position, not a verdict. And a position could be used. She had evidence. The evidence was real, regardless of what today's session had done to her standing in the court's eyes. The ministers might look at their hands, and Dolvain might rush for closed session, and Rowan might say the Queen's concerns are noted in his quiet, absolute voice. But the numbers on those pages did not change because a room full of men had decided not to look at them. The Valdris house had taken imperial treasury funds. The accounts existed. The transfers existed. The dates existed. And now she had something else. She had the shape of Seraphine's strategy, and she had the knowledge that Seraphine had known she was coming. And she had the letter with 2 handwritings, and she had the name Lyra Vale spoken aloud in front of a full court in a way that had been designed to protect the girl, but had instead given Evelina something she had not had before this morning. She had a name, a face to find, a thread to pull. She was 3 corridors from her private chambers when she heard the sound. It was not a significant sound. A door closing too quickly somewhere to her left, in the direction of the East Wing servant corridor, the kind of sound that doors made when they were pushed rather than drawn shut, which usually meant someone in a hurry. It was not a sound she would have noticed on any other day, but today her attention was filed to a particular edge, and the sound caught on it. She stopped. She looked at the servant corridor entrance. Just an archway, just stone. "Dora," she said quietly. "Yes." "Who is quartered in the East Wing?" A pause. "The standard household staff, the kitchen senior staff on the upper floor, and—" Another pause, shorter this time, sharper. "And the temporary quarters that were prepared last month, at the king's request. I believe they are currently occupied." Evelina looked at the archway. "Go about your afternoon," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "As normal. As if nothing has changed." "Your Majesty. Go." Dora went. Evelina stood alone in the corridor and looked at the servant archway and listened. No more sound, just the cold in the stone and the smell of beeswax from a lamp somewhere further down the passage. She did not go toward the archway. Not now. Not today. Not without knowing more. Not without the shape of what she was walking toward. She had already walked into one room today without fully knowing what was in it, and she had paid for that. She turned and walked to her chambers. She changed out of the cobalt gown herself, same as she had put it on. She ate nothing. She sat in the chair by the window that looked out over the inner courtyard where the stable boys were moving horses through the late afternoon light, and she looked at nothing in particular, and she thought. She thought about the letter with 2 handwritings. She thought about Arneth Kavos looking at his hands. She thought about the king's face, that flattened, public, unreachable face, and the 12 years she had spent learning every version of his expression, and the particular quality of the blankness she had seen when he looked at her today, which was not quite the same as his usual public blankness, which had something else layered underneath it. Something that looked, if she was being precise about it, like a man who was working very hard not to look like he was working hard. She thought about all of that for a long time, while the light outside moved from gray afternoon into the gray gold of early evening. Then the door opened, and Dora came in without knocking, which she never did, and her face was the face of a woman carrying something that could not be put down gently. "Your Majesty." Her voice was stripped of the usual framework. "Commander Verath has been arrested." The room went still. "On what charge?" Evelina said. Her voice came out perfectly level. "Treason." Dora swallowed. "They are saying he was found in possession of documents that implicate him in a plot against the king's life. They're saying, Your Majesty, they're saying he was acting at the direction of someone inside the palace." A pause. "Someone close to the queen." Evelina did not move. She sat in her chair with her hands in her lap, exactly as she had sat in the assembly hall, and she looked at the courtyard below where the stable boys were still moving through their work, indifferent and unhurried, and she felt the shape of what was happening settle into her understanding with the slow and absolute weight of stone dropping through water. Verath arrested. The financial evidence tied to him. The trail running back toward her. By morning, she would not be a queen with concerns that had been noted. She would be a queen with a commander under arrest for treason, documents in play that she did not yet know the contents of, and a court that had spent the afternoon deciding she was a jealous woman with a private grievance. She would be isolated, completely. That had been the plan from the beginning. She stood up from the chair. She crossed to the window. She looked down at the courtyard and the horses and the ordinary evening moving across the capital. "Who made the arrest?" she said. "The king's personal guard," Dora said. "On orders from—" A pause. "From Minister Arneth Kavos." Evelina closed her eyes. 1 second. 2. Arneth Kavos, who had looked at his hands this morning while Seraphine spoke. Who had looked at his hands because he had already known what was coming next. Who had voted for the water rights reform. Who had called her the finest administrative mind in a generation, and had meant it, probably, at the time, before he had decided that something else was worth more than his opinion of her mind. She opened her eyes. "Send word to Lord Perrin in the South Ministry," she said. "Tell him I am requesting a private meeting. Tonight. Do not use Verath's network. Go through the trade correspondence channel, the one we established in the second year for the grain subsidy negotiations." She turned from the window. "And find out where Lyra Vale is right now. What room? What floor? Who is with her? Your Majesty. Dora's voice had gone careful. If they have already moved against Verath, and if they believe the evidence points toward you, acting against Lyra Vale now could be used to confirm exactly what Seraphine claimed this morning. They would say, "I am not going to act against anyone," Evelina said. "I'm going to talk to her." To Lyra. Yes. Dora stared at her. If she reports the approach, if she reports it, she reports it, Evelina said. But I think she won't. She turned back toward the window one more time. Outside, the last stable boy was crossing the courtyard, lantern in hand, the flame tiny and steady in the growing dark. I think Lyra Vale is not what they have made her out to be, and I think she knows it, and I think she has been inside this palace long enough to be frightened of the people who put her here. She watched the lantern cross the courtyard and disappear through a doorway. A frightened person will talk to almost anyone who comes to them without a weapon. She turned from the window entirely. "Find me that letter," she said. "The one with 2 handwritings. I need it before the 7th bell. Before everything else, I need that letter." Dora moved toward the door. "And Dora." The handmaid stopped. "Whatever you find out about where Lyra Vale is sleeping tonight," Evelina said, "do not write it down. Not anywhere. Not a single word." Dora nodded and left. Evelina stood alone in her chambers in the failing light and looked at nothing and felt the shape of the game that had been played around her, and the shape of the game she was going to have to play now in return. She had walked into the assembly hall this morning intending to expose a conspiracy. She was walking out of today with her most trusted military commander in chains, her financial evidence effectively buried under procedural language, and the court's sympathy running in a direction that had been engineered with the kind of precision that came from months, maybe years, of preparation. She was not done. She was not even close to done. But the letter. That letter, with 2 different hands. The name Lyra Vale in one ink, and the rest of it in another. Someone had placed that document deliberately in the Valdres folder. Someone had placed it there knowing she would eventually find it. Someone had placed it there wanting her to have it, or wanting someone to find it who would bring it to her, which was not the same thing as wanting to help her, and was in fact its own kind of trap. Or it was not a trap. Or it was a message. Or it was a woman sleeping in the East Wing with one name written in one hand and one life written in another, and everything that had been presented in the assembly hall about who she was and where she had come from and what she had done was as much of a construction as the account ledgers had been. And the truth of her was something entirely different. The truth of Lyra Vale was somewhere in this palace, and whatever it was, whatever it turned out to be, was going to break this thing open. Evelina crossed to her desk. She sat down. She lit the lamp. She pulled a blank sheet of paper toward her, and she picked up her pen and she wrote nothing on it, just held the pen above the paper, and breathed, and let herself think. Somewhere on the other side of this palace, in the East Wing, behind a door that had closed too quickly in an empty corridor, a young woman whose name appeared in a conspiracy with 2 different handwritings was sitting alone with whatever version of the truth she had been given to carry around. And somewhere in this palace, in rooms that Evelina had not yet found, and through channels she had not yet mapped, Seraphine Kaldenvoss was doing the same arithmetic Evelina was doing right now, running the same calculations, moving the same pieces. The difference was, Seraphine thought she had won today. Evelina put the pen down. She almost let herself smile. Almost. The letter was not in the records room. Dora came back at the 6th bell with empty hands and a face that had stopped trying to soften what it was carrying. She stood in the doorway of Evelina's chamber and said it plainly, the way people delivered bad news when they had run out of ways to cushion it. "The folder is there," Dora said. "The Valdres folder. The financial records are there. The letter is not." Evelina did not look up from the desk. She had been sitting in the same position for 40 minutes, lamp burning, blank paper still blank before her, turning over the mechanics of the day. In her mind, the way a woman turned over river stones looking for what lived underneath. When was it last confirmed in the folder? 2 nights ago. I checked it myself before you arrived in the records room that morning. And who had access to the records room between 2 nights ago and this evening? Dora was quiet for a moment. The room is on the secondary archive corridor. It requires a ministry key. That is not what I asked. 3 people hold ministry keys for that corridor. A pause. Minister Kavos, the head archivist, Selin, and Commander Verath. Evelina looked up then. Not at Dora. At the wall. Verath, whose key was now presumably in the possession of whoever had arrested him. The letter was taken before they moved on Verath, she said. It was not a question. She was running the sequence, laying the order of events against each other to find what fit and what didn't. They took the letter first, then they arrested him. Because the letter is what tied everything together. It was the one piece that didn't belong in that folder. The one piece that pointed somewhere they didn't want pointed. They couldn't leave it sitting there for me to recover after Verath was gone. Dora said nothing. Her silence was agreement. Which means, Evelina said, that Seraphine knew about the letter, or someone in her circle did. She stood up from the desk. Which means the letter was placed there deliberately, not as a message to me, as a piece to be retrieved before I could use it. She moved to the window. Night had settled fully over the courtyard now, the stable lanterns out, the stone quiet. I was supposed to find the folder. I was supposed to find the financial records. The letter was placed there to be found alongside them and then removed at the right moment, so that when I tried to produce it, it would be gone, and I would have claimed the existence of evidence that no one else could verify. Dora breathed in slowly. They were going to make you look like you invented it. They were going to make me look like a woman who had gone looking for reasons to believe her husband was faithless and had started seeing evidence that wasn't there. Evelina looked at the dark courtyard. The letter probably named Seraphine directly, or someone close enough to her that producing it in assembly would have ended this before it started. She paused. It would have been too convenient to be real. They built it to be too convenient so that the moment I produced it, the moment I said, look, here's a letter, here's the connection, here is proof, the counter would already be in place, the letter would be gone, and I would have stood in front of the full court holding nothing. The room held the silence of that for a moment. Lord Perrin, Evelina said, did the message go through? I sent it through the trade channel as you instructed. He has not yet responded. He will respond or he won't. Either way, I need to know by morning which side of this he is standing on. She turned from the window. Lyra Vale, where is she? Dora reached into the pocket of her robe and produced a small folded paper, which she crossed the room to hand to Evelina without a word. Evelina opened it. A room number. A floor. One guard posted outside, rotating at the 4th and 10th bells, currently unaccompanied. She folded the paper and held it in her fist. How long is the window between rotations? Roughly 40 minutes around the 4th bell. Evelina looked at the paper in her hand. Dora was watching her with that careful face, the one that meant the handmaid was calculating the same risks her mistress was, and had arrived at conclusions she did not entirely like. If it goes wrong, Dora said quietly, I know. If she tells Seraphine, I know. Evelina set the paper on the desk. But if she has been inside this palace for as long as Seraphine needed her here, and if the story about the assassination attempt is a construction, and it is a construction, or it is built on something real and then bent into a shape it was never meant to have, then Lyra Vale has been living inside someone else's version of her own life for long enough that the pressure of it has to be showing somewhere. She picked up her cloak from the chair. Nobody holds a fabricated story indefinitely without the seams starting to split. You just have to know where to press. She went to the door. Your Majesty. Dora's voice stopped her. Go carefully. Evelina did not answer. She pulled the door open and stepped into the corridor. The east wing at the 4th bell was quiet, in the particular way of palace spaces that held people who were not quite staff and not quite guests. Corridors that were maintained but not trafficked, lit by reduced lamp allotment, the kind of half-dark that existed wherever the court had decided not to look directly. Evelina had walked these corridors before, years ago, when the east wing had been used for the overflow of a visiting diplomatic party, and she knew the layout well enough to move through it without hesitating at corners. She counted doors. Found the number. Stopped. The guard rotation had just turned. She had 38 minutes, by Dora's estimate. She knocked. Silence on the other side. Not the silence of an empty room, the silence of someone who had heard a knock and was deciding whether to answer it. My name is Evelina Rowan, she said quietly, to the door. I am not here with guards. I am not here with a warrant. I am here alone. A pause. I think you already know that whatever is happening in this palace is not going to end well for you. I think you have known it for a while, and I think you would rather talk to me now than to whoever comes through that door next, because whoever comes next will not be alone. The silence held for another 4 seconds. The door opened. Lyra Vale was 24, maybe 25, with the kind of face that would have been pretty under different circumstances and was currently just tired. She was slight, brown-haired, and she held the door with both hands as if she needed the resistance of it to stay upright. Her eyes moved over Evelina with the rapid assessment of someone who had spent a long time being evaluated by others and had learned to evaluate back. She did not curtsy. That was the first thing Evelina noted. "You're smaller than I expected," Lyra said. Her voice was flat and guarded. "May I come in?" A beat. Lyra stepped back from the door. The room was modest for a palace chamber. A bed, a writing table, a single window facing the inner wall rather than the courtyard. A trunk at the foot of the bed that looked barely unpacked, the kind of packing that said the person living here had not allowed themselves to settle. There was a cup on the writing table, a book beside it lying face down, and a small lamp burning at a low wick. The room smelled like someone who had been staying indoors too long. Evelina came in. She did not sit. She stood near the table and looked at the girl and waited. "You're not what they told me you were," Lyra said. "What did they tell you I was?" "Unstable." The word came out clipped. "Obsessive. That you'd been failing in your duties for 2 years, and that the king had—" She stopped. Her jaw worked once. "That the king had decided he needed to manage you." "Manage me," Evelina said. That's the word she used. "Seraphine." Lyra's eyes sharpened slightly. Not surprise, confirmation, like hearing a word spoken aloud that she had been careful not to say herself. "How long have you been here?" Evelina said. 6 weeks. Before that. Silence. "Lyra." She kept her voice level. Not warm, not cold. The voice she used when she needed someone to understand they were talking to a woman who did not have time for performance. "I know about Seraphine's claim in assembly this morning, that you saved the king's life during an assassination attempt, that you came here as an honored guest." She paused. "I also know that story was constructed in advance, that it was deployed as a countermove before I could speak, and that you were not consulted about the version of yourself that was presented to the court this morning." Another pause. "Am I wrong?" Lyra looked at the wall over Evelina's shoulder. Her fingers, hanging at her sides, were very still. Too still. The stillness of hands that had been trained not to betray what they were doing. "They told me I wouldn't be called on to speak publicly," she said finally. "They told me I just had to be here, that my presence was the point." Her voice had flattened further. "I have been in this room for 6 weeks. I eat here, I sleep here. The guard outside is there to keep people out," they said. "I stopped believing that around week 3. "The guard is there to keep you in." Lyra looked at her directly for the first time. "I know what it is. I have known what it is." She swallowed once, hard. "I didn't think anyone was going to come." The room sat quiet for a moment. Evelina heard the lamp wick. Outside, somewhere far below, a door closed in the courtyard. "Your family," Evelina said. Lyra's face did a thing that she immediately controlled, but it was a half-second too slow. "Where are they?" She said they were safe. The words came out pressed thin. She said as long as I did what I was told, they were safe. "They're in Marthfield, my mother and my younger brother. Seraphine has a man in Marthfield who sends her word every 2 weeks. She breathed in. "I have not had direct contact with them since I arrived here." Evelina was quiet. She was looking at the girl, at the particular quality of tension in her face that came from a specific kind of being trapped. Not panicked, not broken, but drawn tight. The way rope drew tight when it had been tested repeatedly and had not yet snapped, but was no longer the thing it had originally been. "I need you to tell me what you were instructed to do," Evelina said. "Not the public version, not the assassination story. What Seraphine actually told you your role was." A long pause. The lamp threw the shadow of the cup against the wall in a shape that moved when the flame moved. "I was told to stay in the palace," Lyra said. "To be seen, occasionally, entering and leaving rooms in the east wing. To be seen once in the upper garden at a time when the queen's handmaids would be walking the lower path." She stopped. "To make it look like there was something to look at. I didn't have to do anything. I just had to exist in the right places at the right times." She looked down at the table. "I'm not the king's lover. I have spoken to the king twice, both times in the presence of other people. He looked at me the way you look at furniture you didn't choose." Evelina let that sit for one full second before she asked the next question. "The letter," she said, "with your name on the outside and different handwriting inside. Do you know what it was?" Lyra stilled. the kind of still that meant recognition. You found it. I found it. Someone took it back. I wrote it. Lyra's voice had gone quieter. I wrote the outside. Seraphine's man dictated the inside. I wrote it word for word because he stood there and watched me write. He said it was insurance. For both of us, he said. She looked at Evelina. I didn't know what was in it. I wrote what he said. My name on the outside because it was addressed to me. His words on the inside. What did his words say? Lyra shook her head once. I don't know. He covered the paper in sections. I wrote what I could see, and then he covered it and showed me the next section. When I was done, he took the whole thing. A pause. He came back a week later, and I was told it had been placed somewhere for safekeeping. I think I was told it in a way that was meant to scare me, to remind me that there was something with my handwriting on it that could be made to look like whatever they needed it to look like. Evelina breathed in slowly through her nose. The letter had not been placed as a message to her. It had not been placed as a trap. It had been placed as a leash on Lyra, first, and on whoever found it later as a secondary function. A document with a young woman's handwriting that could be shaped into evidence of anything, held in a place designed to be discovered, ready to be deployed or denied or disappeared depending on what the situation required. That was the kind of instrument that took months to build. She looked at Lyra Vale standing in this dim room, in this East Wing corridor, with her barely unpacked trunk and her controlled hands, and her family 60 miles away in Marthfield, and she thought about the shape of what had been built around this girl, and she felt the thing behind her sternum again. Not the contraction from this morning, not fear, something else, something colder and more particular. If I could give you a way out of this palace, Evelina said quietly, with your family safe and your name clear, what would you be willing to do in return? Lyra looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were dark and steady and tired in a way that went deeper than 6 weeks. What would you need? She said. I would need you to tell the court what you just told me. The silence that followed was not hesitation. It was calculation. Evelina could see it. The girl was not naive, had never been naive. That much was clear. And she was running the same arithmetic Evelina was running, the same accounting of risk against risk and bad option against worse option. If I testify, Lyra said slowly, Seraphine has the letter, with my writing on it. A letter you were coerced into writing. That is a different legal standing than a letter you authored. Then you prove I was coerced? Can you describe the man who dictated it to you? A pause. Yes. Then we can find him, and when we find him, the letter becomes evidence against Seraphine rather than against you. Evelina kept her voice level and direct. This was not the time for warmth, and it was not the time for threat. It was the time for two women in a dim room talking about the plain facts of their situation. I will not mislead you. This is dangerous. If Seraphine moves before I do, or if the ministers she has bought move before I can reach the ones she hasn't, then none of what you tell me will reach a forum that can act on it. She held Lyra's gaze. But if you stay in this room doing nothing, the ending is already written. When Seraphine no longer needs your presence here, your usefulness ends. And when your usefulness ends, I know, Lyra said, flat, certain. I've known for 3 weeks. Evelina nodded once. Then you already know what the alternative is worth. Another silence. The lamp on the table guttered slightly in a draft from under the door. Lord Perrin, Lyra said abruptly. Evelina went still. What about him? His name was in the section I was allowed to see. In the letter, right before the man covered it. Her eyes were fixed somewhere past Evelina's shoulder, pulling at the memory. He was named as someone who had already agreed to something. I didn't know what. I didn't know who he was at the time. She focused back on Evelina's face. Is he someone you were counting on? The cold thing behind Evelina's sternum spread outward along her ribs. Lord Perrin, of the South Ministry, whose name she had given Dora less than 2 hours ago, whose address she had sent through the Trade Correspondence Channel, the channel established in the second year for the grain subsidy negotiations. The channel she had believed was clean because it had never been used for anything that mattered until tonight. Until tonight, when she had used it to send Lord Perrin a message requesting a private meeting. A message that had now traveled through a channel that Seraphine, apparently, already knew about. Evelina kept her face exactly as it was. How long ago did you see that name? She said. 5 weeks. My second week here. 5 weeks. Perrin had been part of this for at least 5 weeks. The message she had sent him tonight was not going to reach an ally. It was going to reach a man who would carry it directly to Seraphine before morning. She had just told Seraphine she was still moving. She had just told her she was still looking for support. She had just told her, through the simple act of reaching out to a man who had already been bought, exactly how much she did not yet know. She turned toward the door. Her face was composed. Her hands were loose at her sides. The distance between the table and the door was 12 steps, and she walked them without hurrying. "Your Majesty." Lyra's voice caught her at the door. Not loud, not desperate, just direct. The voice of someone who had decided. Evelina stopped, hand on the door. She looked back over her shoulder. Lyra was standing in the middle of the room, with her hands no longer pressed flat against her sides. She looked exhausted and frightened and something else, something that was close to resolved, which was the most dangerous thing a trapped person could look, because resolved people did things. "If you find a way to get word to my family before any of this moves," Lyra said, "before Seraphine knows I've talked to you, if you can get them out of Marthfield." "I will try," Evelina said. "Don't try." Lyra's voice did not waver. "Do it or don't. I need to know which one." Evelina looked at her. The lamp between them threw a thin gold line across the floor. "I will do it," she said. "You have my word." She went out. The corridor was empty. She moved fast, not running. Running left marks. Running was what frightened people did, and frightened people got noticed. But fast, the kind of pace that looked like purpose rather than flight. She turned left at the first junction, away from the direct route back to her chambers, toward the inner servants' stair that ran along the back of the palace's middle section, the route the kitchen staff used at dawn, and that was empty in the 4th bell hour. She was 2 landings up when the full weight of it hit her. Perrin was compromised. The trade correspondence channel was compromised. Seraphine had the letter with Lyra's handwriting. Varath was in chains with treason documents she had not seen, but could already guess at. The assembly hall had watched Seraphine reframe the queen as a jealous, unstable woman before a full gallery, and Rowan had let it happen. And the ministers who had looked at their hands instead of at their queen were not looking at their hands because they were ashamed. They were looking at their hands because they had already decided which way to face. She stopped on the landing. Her hand went to the wall. The stone was cold under her palm, cold and solid and real. She pressed against it and breathed. In, out. She had Lyra's account. She had the description of the man who had dictated the letter. She had, if she could reach someone uncorrupted before Seraphine learned that Perrin had received her message, the shape of a defense. But by morning, Seraphine would know that Evelina had reached out to Perrin. And Seraphine, who had spent months building this structure piece by piece, who had planned for the assembly session and the letter retrieval and Varath's arrest and the gallery full of witnesses, would understand exactly what that reach meant. She would know the queen was still standing, and she would move to change that before the sun came up. Evelina pushed off from the wall and kept climbing. She needed one person in this palace who had not been bought, one voice that Seraphine had not yet reached, one door that had not already been closed and locked from the inside. And she needed to find it tonight, before Perrin's message arrived. Wherever it was going, before the machinery that had already swallowed Varath turned toward her with the same teeth, she reached the upper corridor, turned toward her chambers, and stopped dead. Because standing at the far end of the corridor, outside her chamber door, with the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting long enough to stop pretending he wasn't waiting, was King Alpha Rowan. No attendants, no guards, just the king in his gray coat, standing in the dim corridor outside his wife's door in the middle of the night. And when he saw her, he did not move, but something in his face shifted in the lamplight. Something that she had not seen on his face this morning, that she had not seen in the assembly hall, that she had not seen, now that she thought about it, in longer than she could quickly calculate. It looked like fear. He had not come to her chambers in 14 months. Evelina knew the number because she had stopped counting at some point, and then found that she still knew it, the way you knew the location of an old scar without having to look. Not from grief, not anymore, but from the simple habit of a body that cataloged damage automatically. 14 months. And now he was standing in her corridor at the 4th bell with no attendants and no prepared face, and something in his eyes that she did not have a quick name for. She walked toward him. She kept her pace even. She did not let the fact of his presence in this corridor rearrange her face into anything he could use. When she was close enough that lowering her voice was practical, She stopped. My king. Don't, he said. His voice was stripped of the assembly register. No flatness, no managed distance, just his actual voice, which she had not heard in long enough that it landed strangely. Not tonight. She looked at him. The lamp in the corridor sconced through half his face into shadow and left the other half too exposed. And what she saw in the exposed half was a man who had spent the evening doing arithmetic that had led him somewhere he had not expected to arrive. Then say what you came to say, she said. He looked down the corridor in both directions. Reflex, not calculation, checking for ears the way men checked when they were about to say something that could not be taken back. Then he looked at her. I didn't know about Verath, he said. Evelina said nothing. The arrest order came through Kavos. I was told it was a security matter, that Verath had been found with documents implicating him in a plot against the throne. His jaw worked once. I signed the detention warrant because that is the protocol, and I followed the protocol, and He stopped. His hands, she noticed, were not quite still at his sides. I did not ask the right questions. No, she said. You didn't. He absorbed that, the directness of it. This morning, he started. You let Seraphine speak over me in a full assembly session, Evelina said. Her voice was not raised. It did not need to be. You used your procedural authority to shut down my request for open examination of Treasury records. You said the Queen's concerns are noted in front of 100 people, including the upper gallery. She paused. Which of those would you like to address first? Rowan looked at her with that fear still visible in his face. Up close it was more specific than she had read from a distance. It was not the fear of a man afraid for himself. It was the fear of a man who had started to understand the shape of something he had been standing inside without seeing its walls. She told me, he said slowly, 6 weeks ago, that you had become unstable, that you had been making accusations against ministers, that you needed to be managed carefully, or the court would... He stopped again. She said the woman in the East Wing was a matter of imperial security, that her presence needed to appear to be something else in order to protect her actual purpose. He looked at the wall. I believed her. You believed her, Evelina said. I have known Seraphine for 30 years. I know. She kept her voice level. That is exactly how it works. The corridor held the silence of that. Rowan looked back at her, and whatever he found in her face, not anger, not grief, just the flat territory of a woman who had moved past the point where being right was satisfying, seemed to cost him something. What has she built? He said. Quiet. Genuine. The voice of a man asking for information, not absolution. Evelina looked at him for a long moment. She was running the calculation fast. What to tell him? How much? What his knowing would cost versus what it would buy. He was the king. He was also a man who had signed a detention warrant without asking the right questions, who had let Seraphine speak for 6 weeks about his wife's instability without once coming to his wife and asking, and who had stood on a throne dais this morning with a public face while his stepmother publicly dismantled the Queen's credibility in front of a full gallery, but was also standing in her corridor at the 4th bell, alone, without guards. That was either the most important variable or a trap with one more layer than she had found so far. She spent 2 seconds deciding which. Financial agreements made without imperial authorization, she said. 3 shadow accounts running imperial treasury funds through a Valdris merchant house with eastern border connections. Minister Kavos, Minister Dolvain, at least 2 others I have not yet confirmed, and Lord Perrin of the South Ministry. She watched his face. Perrin's name appears in a document I have reason to believe Seraphine has controlled since it was created. She paused. I sent Perrin a message tonight requesting a meeting. Before I knew his name was in that document. He will report that message to Seraphine if he has not already. Rowan went very still. She will know that I am still moving, Evelina said. She will know that whatever the assembly session did to my standing in the court, it did not finish me. And she will act on that information before morning. She held his gaze. So whatever you came here to say to me, you need to say it now, and it needs to be something I can use. Because in approximately 4 to 6 hours, this situation changes in a way that makes it very difficult to change back. Rowan held her gaze. She could see him processing, not with the performance of deliberation, but with the actual grinding machinery of a man, recalibrating every decision of the past 6 weeks against the framework he had just been handed. The Moonfire Banquet, he said. Seraphine arranged it. The invitations went out 3 days ago. Half the court will be there. Ministers, generals, the full noble gallery from this morning, plus the outer province lords who winter in the capital. His voice had steadied into something harder. She pushed the date forward. It was supposed to be the end of the month. She moved it to 4 days from now. 4 days. Evelina felt the click of it. The assembly session had been today. The banquet in 4 days. Not enough time for her to rebuild political ground. Not enough time to replace the network. Verath's arrest had severed. Not enough time to reach the ministers who hadn't yet been bought and bring them to a position where they could act in her favor publicly. 4 days was exactly not enough time, which was the point. She is going to use the banquet, Evelina said. Yes. For what? Rowan's face did something complicated and then went flat. I don't know the specifics. I know she has been meeting privately with Kavos and with 2 generals from the eastern garrison. I know she told me 2 weeks ago that the banquet would be an occasion to, she said, to clarify the court's understanding of the current situation. He stopped. At the time, I did not know what situation she meant. And now? Now I think she means you. The corridor was cold. Evelina's back was cold through the fabric of her cloak, the stone behind her radiating the particular chill of a building that had been cold for 3 centuries and intended to remain so. She breathed it in. Let it anchor her. I need 2 things from you, she said. Tonight, before anything else moves. He waited. I need access to the garrison records for the Eastern deployment over the past 8 months. Not through Kavos's office. Through the military archives. Direct access. My handmaid to collect. Your seal on the request so it cannot be refused. She held his gaze. And I need the name of one minister in this court who has not been touched by Seraphine's agreements. One man who has clean hands and enough seniority to call for a formal review of the Verath arrest warrant on procedural grounds. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his face that was not quite grief and not quite anger. The particular expression of a man encountering the specific shape of his own failure. Herath, he said finally. Lorik Herath. He is old and he does not come to every session, and Seraphine has always dismissed him as a spent force. A pause. He may be the only minister she did not bother to buy because she did not think he mattered anymore. Where does he quarter? The North Annex, 3rd floor. I will go to him tonight. Evelina. The sound of her name, her actual name, not her title, in his actual voice, stopped her the way nothing else had. She looked at him. I am sorry, he said. For this morning. For the 14 months before it. For the things I did not ask and the things I chose not to see. He said it cleanly, without decoration, the way a man said something he had been carrying long enough that he no longer had any performance left to put around it. I know that does not change the shape of the problem. She looked at him for a long moment. No, she said. It doesn't. She turned toward the corridor that led to the North Annex. Get me the garrison records. Tonight. She did not look back. Lorik Herath answered his door at the 5th bell in a nightrobe and with the face of a man who had not slept well in years and had therefore stopped being startled by waking. He was 71, heavy through the shoulders despite his age, with white hair that had gone fully untamed, and he looked at Evelina standing in his doorway and then at the empty corridor behind her and then back at her. Your Majesty, he said, with the particular dryness of a man choosing not to comment on the obvious. I need an hour of your time, Lord Herath. I expect you need rather more than that. He stepped back from the door. Come in. The next 40 minutes were the most useful 40 minutes Evelina had spent in a week. Herath was not warm, and he was not particularly sympathetic, and he had the manner of a man who had watched courts rise and fall, long enough that very little surprised him, which made him the ideal audience for what she had to say. She told him about the financial records, the Valdris accounts, the name she had confirmed and the name she suspected. She told him about Verath's arrest, the detention warrant, the procedural mechanism that Herath, as a senior minister, had the standing to challenge if he chose to. She told him about the Moonfire banquet and the 4-day window. She did not tell him about Lyra Vale. Not yet. Herath listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a while, turning a plain iron ring on his right hand. An old habit, she had seen it in assembly sessions, the ring his first wife had given him 40 years ago, the wife who had been dead for 20. The Valdris house, he said finally. Those accounts existed in a version I saw 3 years ago. I raised a concern in closed session. Kavos told me the accounts had been reviewed and cleared. He looked at the ring. I did not push further because pushing further in closed session with Kavos running the floor is approximately as useful as pushing against a wall. He looked up. I should have pushed further. Yes, Evelina said. He absorbed that the same way Rowan had. No flinching. The arrest warrant, he said. Procedural review is possible, but it requires a supporting minister and a written objection filed within 72 hours of the detention order. He paused. The detention order was filed this afternoon. That gives me until the day after tomorrow. Can you file it? I can file it. Whether it produces anything before the banquet is a different question. He stood, moving to his writing table with the deliberateness of old joints that had learned not to be rushed. What I can do alongside it is call for a review of the Treasury oversight process, broader than the Valdris account specifically, cast it as a systemic question of protocol rather than an accusation against specific ministers. He sat at the table and looked at her. That takes the target off your back and puts it on the system. Seraphine cannot easily counter a procedural review the same way she countered personal accusations. Evelina felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not relief. Too early for relief. But the specific sensation of a mechanism clicking into place that had been resisting engagement for days. Yes, she said. That. She left Hareth's chambers at the 6th bell with a plan that was not yet solid but had the shape of one. She moved back through the corridors toward her own chambers with the garrison records under her arm. Rowan had sent them through a footman who had been waiting at the north annex staircase with a sealed tube bearing the king's personal mark, and her mind already moving through the next sequence. Herath's procedural review. The garrison records and what they might connect to the Valdris accounts. Lyra's testimony when the time came. The 4 days before the banquet. She turned the last corner before her chambers. Dora was in the corridor, not waiting, standing, which was different, with both hands pressed flat against the wall behind her and her face the color of old ash. Evelina stopped. Her stomach dropped before her mind had formed the question. What? She said. They came 40 minutes ago, Dora said. Her voice was very controlled and very quiet. 2 men from the king's personal guard. They went to the east wing. A breath. They went to Lyra Vale's room. The garrison records in Evelina's arms suddenly weighed nothing at all. And? She's gone. The room is empty. Dora swallowed. Her trunk is gone. The cup on the table is gone. Whatever she had in that room, it has been cleared. As if she was never there. Evelina stood in the corridor and felt the shape of it land on her with the full force of what it was. Lyra, who had said do it or don't with a steadiness that Evelina had read as resolve. Lyra, who had described the man who dictated the letter, who had confirmed Perrin's name, who had been Evelina's one piece of testimony that could reshape the entire public narrative of what had happened in the assembly hall. Gone. Cleared. As if she was never there. Seraphine had not waited for morning. Perrin must have sent word within the hour. Seraphine had understood immediately what the Queen reaching out to a compromised minister meant. Not that Evelina knew about Perrin specifically, but that she was still moving, still reaching, and the east wing was the most exposed piece on the board. She had pulled Lyra out before Evelina could come back. Before whatever conversation had happened in that dim room could become something that reached daylight. Evelina stood in the corridor with the garrison records, and the silence and the understanding that settled into her like cold water, finding the lowest point of a space, the girl's family in Marthfield. She had given her word. She had said, I will do it, not I will try. She had said it and meant it, and now the piece she had made that promise to had been removed from the board entirely, and she did not know where Lyra was, or whether the men who had cleared that room had been gentle or otherwise. She breathed in. Out. The things she had held together all day by will and architecture and the particular discipline of a woman who had learned early that the court watched queens for cracks. She felt it strain at every joint simultaneously. Not break. She had not broken since she was 19 years old, and she was not going to break in a corridor at the 6th bell. But the strain was real, and she let herself feel it for exactly 3 seconds, because anything less was self-deception, and self-deception at this stage would get her killed. 3 seconds. Then she walked toward her chambers. The garrison records, she said as she moved. I need to read them tonight, every page. She pushed her chamber door open and set the tube on the desk and broke the seal and pulled the papers out without sitting. Wake me at the 8th bell if I have fallen asleep. Do not let me sleep past the 8th bell. Your Majesty. Dora had followed her in. She was still ash-colored. If Seraphine has moved Lyra, then I no longer have the testimony I was planning to use at the banquet. Evelina spread the first garrison record across the desk. Which means I need to find something in here that does not require Lyra Vale to be present in order to be true. She looked at the papers. The Eastern Garrison deployment records for 8 months. Troop movements, supply requisitions, officer transfers, allocation orders. The kind of documentation that was dry enough to put a man to sleep and detailed enough to hide almost anything inside it. Because everything significant that moved through an empire moved first through its logistics, and the logistics were always the last thing anyone wanted to read. She pulled the lamp closer and started reading. An hour into the records, she found the first supply requisition that didn't fit. A weapons order. Standard infantry equipment, nothing unusual in type. But the delivery destination was coded to a garrison post that did not appear anywhere else in the 8 months of records. A garrison post that, as far as she could determine from the geographic notation, was positioned not at the eastern border but 60 miles inside the border. In territory that was technically still imperial, but that had been under dispute with the eastern separatist lords for 2 years. Not a defensive posting. A staging position. She kept reading. Found 2 more. Different months, different requisition officers, same destination code. Her hand on the page was completely steady. Inside her chest, something that was not quite fear and not quite triumph was building with the particular pressure of a discovery that changed the size of what you were looking at. She had come into this week believing she was fighting a woman who wanted influence over a court. A scheming stepmother with purchased ministers and a manufactured scandal. The kind of conspiracy that was ugly and dangerous and destructible if you found the right seams. What the garrison records were showing her was not that. 60 miles inside the disputed Eastern Territory. 3 separate weapons deployments over 8 months. Valdris House, which had eastern border connections she had noted but not fully traced. Ministers and generals. The Moonfire banquet in 4 days. She pressed both hands flat on the desk and leaned over the papers and looked at what she was looking at. This was not a woman who wanted to control a court. This was a woman who had been positioning something much larger, much longer, and using the court, using the scandal and the assembly session and the jealous queen narrative as cover for something that the court, if it understood what it was looking at, would not have permitted. Seraphine was not trying to destroy Evelina to take her place beside the king. She was trying to destroy Evelina because the queen was the one person in this palace who had been looking at the financial records. And the financial records were the one thread that, pulled far enough, would unravel not a personal conspiracy, but a foreign operation being run through the imperial court from the inside. Evelina straightened. She looked at the papers spread across her desk. She looked at the lamp. She looked at the wall. She had been fighting the wrong war. She had been fighting for her standing in court, for the credibility she had lost in the assembly hall, for Verath's release and the restoration of the financial evidence and the chance to stand before a gallery and prove that what she had claimed was true. She had been fighting to survive inside the court she knew. But the ground had shifted under everything, and what she was standing on now was not the court she knew. What she was standing on now required a different kind of woman than the one who had dressed herself in cobalt silk this morning and walked into an assembly hall with evidence memorized and her neck bare and her hands clean. The woman she needed to be in the next 4 days did not have clean hands as an option. She gathered the garrison records into a single stack. She set them at the back of the desk where they would not be visible from the door. She stood for a moment in the quiet of her chamber with the lamp throwing her shadow long against the wall. Then she sat down, pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her, and began to write. Not to Herath, not to Rowan, not to anyone inside this palace, inside this court, inside the system that had already been penetrated 3 layers deep by people who had been bought or coerced or maneuvered into position months before she had started paying attention. She wrote to a name she had not used in 7 years. A man who had worked in the Imperial Intelligence Office under the old king and who had left before Rowan's reign under circumstances that had never been fully explained, and who lived now, as far as her information reached, in the trading city of Venmarch on the southern coast. A man who had no allegiance to the current court because the current court had made clear it wanted none from him. A man who, 7 years ago, had told her something she had not understood the significance of at the time. He had told her, "The most dangerous thing in an empire is not an enemy outside the walls. It is the door inside the wall that nobody is watching because everybody agreed years ago that it leads nowhere. She wrote the letter. She folded it. She sealed it with plain wax, no mark. She would not survive the next 4 days as the woman she had been. The woman she had been fought inside the rules of a game she had believed she understood. The game she was actually in had no rules she had been told about, and the players she was facing had been running it for longer than she had been on the board. So she was going to have to become something the rules had not prepared for. She held the sealed letter in her hand and looked at the lamp and let herself understand, fully, without softening, what that meant, what it would cost, what she would have to do before the moonfire banquet that could not be undone afterward. The lamp burned steady. Outside, the capital was quiet in the deep night cold. And 4 days from now, the Empire's most powerful people would gather in candlelit rooms to watch whatever Seraphine had planned, and none of them, not the ministers, not the generals, not the foreign agents who had been building this for the better part of a year, none of them had accounted for the possibility that the queen they had spent 6 weeks painting as unstable had been reading garrison records at the 6th bell and had just found the door inside the wall. She set the letter on top of the stack of garrison records. Then she blew out the lamp, lay down on the chair without moving to the bed, and closed her eyes. She would sleep for 2 hours. She would wake before Dora came, and when she woke, she would be, completely and without remainder, the woman this situation required. Whatever that woman was, she had 4 days to become her. She slept for 90 minutes, not 2 hours. Her body had its own accounting, and it woke her before the calculation was finished, some instinct older than thought pulling her out of the dark at the 7th bell, with her hand already reaching for the lamp. She lit it. She sat up in the chair. She pressed both palms flat against her thighs and breathed and let the room assemble itself around her. Desk, garrison records, sealed letter, the particular cold that came through the walls at this hour. 3 days and change until the moonfire banquet. She stood, crossed to the basin, broke the skin of ice that had formed overnight on the water's surface with the heel of her hand, and washed her face in the cold underneath. The shock of it was useful. She needed useful things right now. She had no room in the next 72 hours for anything that wasn't. Dora arrived at the 7th bell and a quarter with bread and hard cheese, and a face that had aged overnight in the particular way of faces that had been doing their grieving in private. She set the food on the table without comment. She looked at the ice water in the basin, and then at her mistress, and then at the garrison records stacked at the back of the desk. "You found something," she said. "I found the actual shape of it." Evelina picked up the sealed letter and held it out. "This needs to go to Venmarch, not through any palace channel, not through any minister. I need a courier who has no existing connection to this court, a hired man, someone from the lower city, someone who would be unremarkable on a southern road." Dora took the letter and looked at the address on the outside. Her brow moved slightly. "Cashin Miral. You remember him." "I remember that the old king's people removed him from the intelligence office for reasons nobody ever explained, and that he left the capital on a horse with nothing but what he could carry." She turned the letter in her hands. "You trust him." "I trust that he has no reason to help Seraphine, and every reason to want to know what I found in those garrison records." Evelina sat and pulled the bread toward her and ate a piece without tasting it. "He will understand the deployment data in ways I cannot. He worked the Eastern Border Intelligence for 6 years under Aldrich." She paused. "And he owes me a debt from the 3rd year of this reign that he has not yet had occasion to repay." Dora nodded once and tucked the letter inside her robe. "The courier. By the 8th bell. Before this palace wakes properly and the corridor traffic starts." Dora left. Evelina ate the rest of the bread and the cheese and drank cold water and looked at the garrison records, and let herself sit with the full weight of what she had read in them for a long moment before she moved into the next sequence of decisions, because the habit of moving too fast through bad information was how you ended up acting on incomplete pictures, and she had already done that once this week with Perrin's name. 3 staging positions, 60 miles inside disputed territory. The Valdris accounts funding military logistics, not personal enrichment. Minister Kavos running the detention warrant for Verath, which was not the action of a man covering a financial scandal, but the action of a man covering an operational security breach. And Seraphine, who had married an old king and outlasted him and stayed in this court for 11 years after his death, building something that was not about proximity to power for its own sake, but about positioning, long, patient, systematic positioning for a moment that required a specific configuration of pieces, and that moment was apparently 4 days away. The Moonfire Banquet, with its full court attendance and its outer province lords wintering in the capital, was not going to be the occasion of a public accusation against the queen, though it would include that. It was going to be the occasion of something that required every significant power center in the empire to be in one building on one night, occupied with a domestic scandal loud enough to fill the room, while something else happened in the east. She had to reach Herath before the procedural review became the most important thing on the board. And she had to do it in a way that did not alert whoever was watching the North Annex corridor that she was doing it, because by now, by the 7th bell the morning after she had sent a message to Perrin that had presumably been relayed to Seraphine within the hour, the palace's watching eyes had been reoriented. She was the active target. She moved carefully. The next 3 days were not the 3 days she had planned from the floor of Herath's chamber. She did not go back to the North Annex openly. She sent Dora with 3 separate messages over the course of the first day, each one using different language that Herath would read as layered, each one building toward a picture she did not want to put in writing directly. Herath was old, but he was not slow, and by the afternoon of the first day he had filed the procedural review not only of Verath's detention warrant, but of the entire Eastern Garrison deployment authorization chain for the past year, citing a systemic oversight question about command authorization in disputed territory. It was dry. It was procedural. It was exactly the kind of document that bureaucratic men filed when they were trying to look like they were filing something routine, and Seraphine, who had spent her career managing men's perceptions of what mattered, would likely read it as exactly that. Evelina was counting on her reading it as exactly that. The first day also brought Rowan back to her. Not to her chambers this time, to the private garden behind the east wing, where she had gone in the afternoon under the pretense of her usual walk, which she had maintained through every political season of this marriage, because the appearance of normalcy was sometimes the only cover a person had. He was already there when she arrived, sitting on the stone bench near the bare winter hedge, with his coat collar up and his hands folded, looking like a man waiting for a sentence to be handed down. She sat beside him, not close, the appropriate distance. "The garrison records," she said quietly, without preamble. "The 3 deployment orders. Did you sign them?" He looked at the dead hedge. "2 of them. The 3rd I don't remember seeing. Who brings you deployment orders for signature?" "Kavos, through the military secretary." So Kavos had moved one without Rowan's signature, which was a crime on its own, and had moved 2 others through the king without telling him what he was signing, which required either extraordinary audacity or the comfortable certainty that the king would not look closely at logistics paperwork. Evelina had no trouble believing the latter. Rowan was a man of large decisions and broad strokes, and he had always delegated the fine grain of administration to ministers he trusted. It was his most significant flaw as a ruler, and they had argued about it in the 2nd year of the reign, and she had eventually stopped arguing because arguing with a wall was a form of self-harm. "There is something planned for the Eastern Territory on the night of the banquet," she said, "or within 24 hours of it. The deployment positions are staging for something mobile and fast. Not a defensive installation, not a garrison rotation." She kept her voice even and quiet. "I believe the banquet is designed to occupy the court, to be a loud, visible, internally focused event, while whatever is moving in the east moves. The scandal is the cover. I was the scandal." Rowan turned to look at her. His face had gone the color of the winter stone behind him. "If Herath's procedural review draws attention to the deployment authorization chain," she continued, "Seraphine will know she has a time problem. She cannot afford to have the garrison records examined before the banquet. She will accelerate the timeline, or she will move against Herath." She paused. "Probably both." "What do you need from me?" Rowan said. His voice was stripped down to its actual materials again. No court register. No managed distance, just the man asking the question with the directness of someone who had run out of ways to be indirect. "I need you to do nothing visible for the next 2 days." She held his gaze. "Nothing that signals to Seraphine that you have recalibrated. No sudden access restrictions. No conversations with ministers she would notice. You need to look exactly like the man you have been for the past 6 weeks. A king who believed his stepmother's version of his wife's instability and is now waiting for the court to manage the situation." She paused. "Can you do that?" It cost him something. She saw it cross his face. "Yes." "On the night of the banquet," she said, "I will need you ready to move fast when I give you the signal. I will not know the shape of that until the night itself." But I will need you standing with me, and I will need you to be the one who seals the doors. A long pause. The winter garden was gray and cold, and the only sound was the distant sound of the kitchen staff's morning work coming from a far wing. I will be standing with you, he said. She stood. She did not offer him warmth, and she did not withhold it. She simply did not have it to give right now. She had used everything she had on staying functional through the past 72 hours, and she was running on the same cold discipline that had gotten her through every hard thing in 12 years of this marriage, which was the knowledge that the crisis in front of her was always more important than the grief underneath it. The grief could be addressed when the crisis was over, if the crisis was ever over. Don't be late to the banquet, she said, and left him on the stone bench in the winter cold. The letter to Cashin Myril reached Venmarch in 2 days. She did not know how she knew this. She had not received a reply, could not have received a reply in that time. But she knew it the way she knew things she had no rational basis for knowing, through the particular internal register of a plan that was moving at the pace she had calculated and not fighting her. The second day brought 2 things she had not accounted for. The first was a message delivered to her chamber by a kitchen boy who had been paid by someone who was not Dora, a folded paper with no seal slipped under the door at the midday bell that contained 3 words in a hand she did not recognize. She read it twice, set it down, read it again. The words were, "Vale is safe." She did not know who had sent it. She had 3 theories, none provable. She filed the information in the part of her mind that held things she could not yet use and moved on. The second thing was Seraphine. Not in the assembly hall. Not in a formal session. In the corridor outside the Queen's receiving room, at the 3rd bell of the afternoon, positioned there as if by accident, by coincidence, by the particular coincidence that very deliberate people manufactured when they wanted to deliver a message without creating a record of having delivered it. Seraphine was wearing gray today. The Caldenvoss colors, not the Rowan House colors. The shift was information. "Your Majesty," Seraphine said. Her voice was the same as it always was, warm, without warmth. Evelina stopped. She did not rearrange her face. She looked at Seraphine with the same flatness she had used in the assembly hall and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not be used, and because the kind of silence that forced the other person to continue speaking was one of the few weapons she could carry openly in a palace corridor. Seraphine smiled the small smile. "I wanted you to know," she said, "that what happened in the assembly was not personal. I hope you understand that." "I understand what it was," Evelina said. "You are a capable woman. You have been a capable queen. The situation simply required a reorientation." Seraphine tilted her head slightly. "Whatever you have found in the garrison records, and I expect you have been reading them carefully, you are nothing if not thorough. I hope you will consider the consequences of acting on partial information." A pause, precise as a blade placement. Partial information has led good people to very serious mistakes before. Evelina looked at her for a long moment. She was aware of her own heartbeat in the way she had been aware of it in the assembly hall, present, deliberate, not racing. She was also aware very clearly that Seraphine had just told her 3 things: that the garrison records had been noticed missing or accessed, that she knew Evelina had them, and that she was worried enough about what Evelina might do with them to come to this corridor in person. People who had already won did not come to corridors in person. "Thank you for the advice," Evelina said, and walked past her. She felt Seraphine's gaze on her back for the entire length of the corridor. She did not turn around. The night of the Moonfire banquet arrived cold and clear, the kind of winter night that stripped everything down to its essential outlines. Sharp stars, hard frost on the stone paths of the palace courtyards, breath visible in the air outside the lit windows of the grand banquet hall. Evelina dressed herself again. The same deliberate choice as the assembly morning. Same cobalt gown, because there was a language to returning to the same ground in the same colors that required no words, and she intended every person in that hall to read it. The banquet hall was the largest room in the palace, built for the old king's campaign celebrations and repurposed by successive monarchs for the kind of events where the entire architecture of power needed to be physically present in one space. It seated 300. Tonight it held close to that. Ministers and their wives, generals with their decorations, the outer province lords who came to the capital in winter and spent the cold months reminding the court they existed, and the noble gallery crowd that had filled the assembly hall 4 days ago and had come back for more, because the court in winter was largely a theater, and the production currently running was the most interesting in years. Evelina entered with Dora 2 steps behind her. She did not enter from the main doors. She entered from the side passage that connected to the Queen's preparation rooms. Her traditional entrance at formal banquets, unremarkable to anyone who knew protocol, which everyone here did. The hall was already full. The long tables set with the moonfire candles, pale white wax, dozens of them, the event's namesake, through light that was more shadow than illumination, the kind of light that made everyone look slightly more beautiful and slightly more dangerous than they actually were. She moved through the room, and she was aware of every eye that tracked her, and every eye that deliberately did not, and she was building the map of it even as she walked, filing positions and expressions, and the particular body language of people who knew something was going to happen tonight and were already calculating where to stand when it did. Seraphine was at the head table, positioned to the right of where the king would sit. The advisory placement again, the same geography as the assembly hall, the same insistence on proximity that was not quite the throne and was never directly challenged because challenging it required making it significant, and you did not make things significant that you were trying to reduce. Lyra Vale was not in the room. Evelina had looked for her in the first sweep of the space. She was not there. Whatever Vale is safe meant, it had moved the girl out of the hall's geography, which was either a relief or a complication, depending on what Seraphine had planned, and whether Lyra's testimony would be needed tonight in person. Evelina took her seat. She poured her own water. She looked at the candles, and she breathed, and she waited. Rowan entered at the 9th bell with the correct ceremony and the gray coat and the public face, and he sat on the throne chair at the head of the long table, and he did not look at Evelina, and he did not look at Seraphine, and the fact that he had successfully managed to look like a man engaged in the ordinary business of attending a formal banquet while carrying the knowledge he was carrying meant he had been paying attention to what she had asked of him. The banquet progressed. Courses were served. Conversation ran at its usual register, the particular elevated volume of 300 people in a candlelit room trying to be overheard, saying the right things. Evelina ate what was put before her and spoke to the minister on her left about the grain allocation revision she had proposed in the spring, and to the general's wife on her right about the winter wool supply. And she watched Seraphine across the table conducting her own conversations with the smooth efficiency of a woman managing a room she considered hers. She watched Kavos arrive late and take his seat midway down the left table, and she watched him look at Seraphine with the quick checking glance of a man confirming a signal, and she watched Seraphine give him the small controlled nod that meant, yes, tonight, soon. She watched Minister Dolvain, 2 seats from Kavos, shift in his chair like a man whose clothing had become too tight. She watched old General Fareth Dunmore, who had been in the rear gallery of the Assembly Hall 4 days ago, and who was now positioned at the lower end of the head table with the 2 Eastern Garrison generals that Rowan had mentioned meeting privately with Seraphine. And she watched the 3 of them not speak to each other with the practiced care of men who had been told not to appear connected. Too many moving parts for this not to be tonight. Seraphine had every piece in place, and the room was at its most controlled, full, occupied, the noise and ceremony providing exactly the cover that the Assembly Hall's formality had not. The assembly had been for the court's education. The banquet was for the finish. The dessert course had just been cleared when Seraphine stood, not with the abruptness she had used in the Assembly Hall. That move had been aggressive, a shock tactic. This one was smooth. She rose from her seat with the unhurried ease of a hostess rising to make a toast, and the room's noise subsided naturally, the way noise subsided when someone with sufficient authority decided to speak, because 300 people had spent enough time in Seraphine's orbit to have internalized the instinct to be quiet when she stood. "My lords," she said, "ladies, generals, my honored guests." She held her wineglass but did not raise it, the gesture of a woman who had something to say before the toast, which communicated that the something mattered. I have been reluctant to speak on a personal matter in a formal setting. I am reluctant still. But I believe this court deserves clarity on a situation that has occupied our attention this past week, and that a public occasion is in some ways the most honest venue for an honest reckoning. She looked briefly at Evelina. The look was calibrated, compassionate, which was the most dangerous register her face could hold. Her Majesty the Queen has in recent days made serious accusations involving the Imperial Treasury. I do not doubt that Her Majesty believes those accusations. I do not doubt that she has suffered, in her mind, from circumstances she has misread. She paused. But I must tell this court something I have been reluctant to say. In the past 2 months, those closest to Her Majesty, including her personal staff and the commander of her guard, have raised concerns about the consistency and clarity of her judgment. She stopped. Let it sit. Commander Verath was arrested not on my initiative, but on the documented concern of 3 ministers who observed specific behavior that— Enough! The word came from Evelina's left. Not from Evelina. Lord Herath was on his feet. I was at the far left of the head table, away from the throne placement, in the seat he had been given because nobody powerful enough to manage the seating had thought of him as someone who needed to be positioned carefully. He stood with the weight of his 71 years and the particular authority of a man who had been underestimated for long enough that he no longer needed anyone's permission to occupy space. The procedural review I filed yesterday, he said, not loudly, but with the kind of carrying quality that did not require volume, covers the Eastern Garrison deployment authorization for the past 8 months. That review has, as of this morning, produced 3 authorization orders that do not carry the correct ministerial countersignature. 2 of those orders carry the King's signature without the required secondary authorization. 1 carries neither. He looked at Kavos. The primary authorization officer on all 3 is Minister Kavos. The room was doing what rooms did when the ground moved under them. A suspended collective intake, 300 people recalibrating simultaneously. Seraphine's face did not move. Evelina was watching it with the focused attention of someone who had decided that face was the most important data source in the room, and what she saw was a woman who had prepared for Herath as a variable and was now sliding one layer of the plan sideways to accommodate him. That sliding was visible, if you knew what to look for, in the half-second before the compassionate expression reasserted itself. Lord Herath, Seraphine said, with a measured patience that itself communicated that his objection was the kind of thing that could be managed. The authorization process for sensitive deployments in disputed territory is handled through a classified protocol that requires the King's written acknowledgement of its classified status. Herath looked at Rowan. Your Majesty, did you acknowledge the classified protocol designation on those 3 deployment orders? Every head at the head table turned to Rowan. This was the moment. Evelina knew it was the moment because she felt the air in the room change pressure, the way air changed before a storm, when the weight of everything above shifted to accommodate what was coming. She looked at Rowan. He was sitting very still with his public face on and underneath it, in the set of his jaw and the particular quality of his stillness. She could see the man she had found in the corridor at the 4th bell, the man who had said, "I am sorry" without decoration, and meant it, and had still come back to the garden bench, and had still said, "I will be standing with you." I was running the same calculation she had run in the East Wing corridor about Lyra Vale. Risk against risk. Bad option against worse option. The version of himself he had been for 6 weeks against the version he needed to be right now. He came down on the right side. I did not, Rowan said. Seraphine's composure held. It was impressive, genuinely impressive, how well she held it. Another woman would have flinched. She simply recalibrated again, moving to the next layer of a plan that had enough layers to absorb several direct hits and still function. Ministers, she said, turning to the room now, abandoning the head table and going for the broader audience the way she had gone for it in the assembly hall. I understand this seems concerning, but what Lord Herath is presenting as an irregularity is in fact the operation of a sensitive security protocol that several of you are aware of and that requires— Sit down, Seraphine. Rowan's voice. Not loud, not raised, the voice of a man who had decided he was done being managed and was discovering that the decision itself carried its own weight. That 12 years on a throne meant something regardless of the 6 weeks that had preceded this moment. That authority was not only what you were given, but what you chose to exercise. The room went completely silent. Seraphine looked at him. Sit down, he said again. Same voice. Now, she sat. Something had shifted in her face in the half-second between his first command and the second. Not fear, not quite. Something more precise than fear. The recognition of a variable that had been calculated as fixed and had moved. Rowan had been the anchor of her plan, the piece she had built everything around, the king who could be managed through his own blind spots and his trust in her. And he was standing up on the board in a direction she had not accounted for. Evelina was already on her feet. She had been waiting for this specific window, for the room's attention to be already broken open, for Seraphine to be on the defensive, for the silence to be the kind that could hold a new voice. She stood, and she looked at the 300 people in the candlelit hall, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not perform. The 3 deployment positions in the Eastern Disputed Territory are not garrison assignments, she said. They are staging positions. The supply requisitions attached to them, which are in the garrison records Lord Herath has now submitted for procedural review, include weapons orders for mobile infantry at a scale inconsistent with defensive posting. She looked at the 2 Eastern garrison generals at the lower end of the table. Both General Ardas and General Corvin have attended private meetings with Lady Seraphine in the past 3 weeks. Their attendance is logged in the palace appointment record, which I requested yesterday through the head archivist Selen. She paused. I would ask both generals to account for the content of those meetings. Ardas was on his feet before she had finished. His face was red and going redder, the face of a military man who had spent 40 years being the one who pointed fingers and was now having one pointed at him in a room full of witnesses. This is a fabrication, he said. His voice was too loud for the silence. The Queen has been building a fantasy of conspiracy for weeks, and now she is standing in front of this court, and, General, Hareth again, dry as stone. Sit down, or I will have you removed on the procedural authority of the review currently in session. Ardas did not sit down. He looked at Seraphine. That was the mistake. Not a large one. Not obvious to anyone who wasn't watching the way Evelina was watching. But he looked at Seraphine for a half-second before he made his next decision, the way a soldier looked at his commanding officer for orders. And every person in the room who had been in a military structure, which was most of the generals and half the ministers, registered what that look meant. General Ardas, Rowan said. Sit. Down. Ardas sat. The candles on the long tables burned steady. 300 people were holding themselves very still, in the particular way that people held still when they were managing the instinct to look like they had known all along which way this was going. Ministers who had been looking at their hands 4 days ago were now looking at the head table with the careful attentiveness of men calculating when it was safe to look like they had been paying attention. Seraphine had not spoken since Rowan had told her to sit. She was sitting very straight in her chair with her wineglass still in her hand, and her face composed and her eyes moving across the room in the rapid, systematic way of a woman who was doing the same calculation Evelina had done on the landing of the servant's stair, counting what she still had, measuring what remained functional, looking for the move that was not yet foreclosed. Evelina watched her do it. She knew what Seraphine was going to reach for. She had known since the corridor conversation 2 days ago, since the partial information warning that had been a tell as much as a threat. When everything else was taken off the board, Seraphine had one piece remaining. She had the letter with Lyra Vale's handwriting. She had a young woman somewhere in this palace or its vicinity who had been her instrument for 6 weeks, and who, if Evelina's own conversation with her had gone differently, could still be made to serve. But Vale is safe had arrived under Evelina's door yesterday. And Evelina had spent 2 days considering what that message meant, and who had sent it, and what it changed. She looked at Seraphine. She waited. Seraphine set her wineglass down. She stood. Her voice, when it came, was stripped of the warmth register. Not angry, not panicked, just direct in a way that her voice rarely was, the voice of a woman who had decided to abandon the performance and go to the material. I have documentation, she said. Correspondence, signed and dated, that implicates the Queen's office in a coordinated attempt to manufacture evidence against ministers of this court. The correspondence involves Commander Verath, whose arrest was based in part on that documentation, and it involves direct orders from the Queen's hand. She looked at Evelina, not with hatred, with the cool assessment of a chess player making the last available move. I will produce that documentation before this court tonight. Evelina said, Produce it. A pause. Seraphine looked at Kavos. Kavos reached into his coat. He produced a folded packet, sealed, and stood to carry it to the head table. He set it before Seraphine. She broke the seal and spread the pages on the table before her and looked at them, and then she went very still. The stillness was different from her controlled stillness. It was the stillness of a person who had opened something expecting to find one thing and had found another. She looked at the pages. She turned the first one over. She looked at the second one. Her face, which had held composure through everything this evening, was doing something underneath the surface that Evelina could see moving like water under ice, pressure building against a surface that was no longer certain of its own strength. These are not, she started. What do they say? Harith asked from his end of the table, in the tone of a man who already knew what they said. Seraphine looked up. She looked at Evelina. Evelina had sent the message to Cashin Miral. Cashin Miral, who had worked Imperial intelligence for 6 years under the old king, who had left the capital on a horse with nothing but what he could carry, who had spent 7 years in Venmarch, which was a trading city on the southern coast where a significant amount of information moved in and out of the empire, because trading cities were where information went when courts had decided they didn't want it anymore, who had, in those 7 years, apparently continued to be the kind of man he had always been. Veil is safe. 3 words under a door, no seal, no signature. She had 3 theories. The one she had given the most weight to was Miral himself, who could have been in the capital already for reasons of his own, or who had moved fast enough on her letter to have a man here, and who had enough reason to pull Lyra Vale out of the East Wing before Seraphine could use her again, because Miral understood leverage and knew that a young woman with coerced handwriting was the kind of piece that got disposed of when it became a liability. And the packet that Seraphine had just opened, the packet that Kavos had carried in his coat, that had been sealed with the seal of documentation that was supposed to implicate the Queen, that packet was not what Seraphine had prepared. Something in it was wrong, and the wrongness was sitting on Seraphine's face like a hand pressed against a wound. "Read it aloud," Evelina said. Her voice was level and carried across the silence of 300 people who had stopped breathing. "Whatever it says, read it to the court." Seraphine looked at the pages in her hands. Her jaw was set. She looked at Rowan. She looked at Kavos, who was standing at the table looking at the packet with a face that had gone the color of old wax. She looked at the pages one more time. She set them face down on the table. She did not read them. That decision, that single, visible refusal, was the answer to every question in the room. 300 people watched Lady Seraphine Kaldenvoss set unread documentation, face down on a banquet table, and understood in the collective and instantaneous way of rooms that had been waiting for a verdict that the verdict had just arrived without requiring further argument. Kavos sat down without being told. Dolvain had been sitting since Ardas had made the mistake of looking at Seraphine for orders. The 2 Eastern generals were very still at the lower end of the table. Harith looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at Evelina. She had one more thing to do. One thing she had been building toward since the 7th bell 2 mornings ago, when she had sat at her desk in the cold and decided what kind of woman this situation required her to be. She had arrived at that woman through 3 days of precise, unsparing work. Not the woman she had been when she walked into the assembly hall in cobalt silk with clean hands and memorized evidence, but not the ruthless version either, not the version that came from nothing left to lose. Something more specific than either. A woman who had looked at the full shape of what was being done and had decided that the answer to a conspiracy that reached from the palace into the Eastern Territory and from the minister's table into foreign operational planning was not to survive it but to dismantle it, piece by piece, from the bottom up, using the patience that her enemies had mistaken for passivity and the intelligence they had mistaken for obsession. She reached into the inside fold of her gown. She produced a single folded paper, which she had placed there herself when she dressed tonight, the same way she had placed every clasp and button herself, deliberately, armor-consciously, knowing what she was walking toward. She unfolded it and set it on the table before her. It was the supply requisition for the 3rd staging position, the one that had not carried Rowan's signature, the one that carried instead, in the small notation field at the bottom left, the code designation of the foreign operational contact through whom the Valdris accounts had been cleared. She had found the code in the last pages of the garrison records, in the margin notation of an allocation order, barely visible in the lamplight at the 4th bell when she was running on 90 minutes of sleep in the cold water she had broken ice to reach. She had nearly missed it. She had almost turned the page. Something had caught, some instinct for the thing that did not belong in the place it was found, sharpened by 3 days of looking at exactly those kinds of things. And she had looked closer. The code corresponded to an intelligence designation, a foreign handler designation, specifically. She knew this because Cashin Miral had included, at the bottom of the letter he had sent back with the same courier who had brought hers to Venmarch, the letter that had arrived this morning, that Dora had brought to her at the 2nd bell with shaking hands, a translation key for Eastern Border Intelligence designations that he had memorized during 6 years of that work, and that he had, in his own words, been waiting for an excuse to use. She looked at Seraphine across the candlelit table. "The designation of the bottom of this requisition," she said, Identifies the operational contact who authorized the Valdris payments as a foreign handler working under the Eastern Separatist Council. Not a Caldenmore national, not a minister, not a general. She paused. A foreign agent who has been operating inside this court for at least 2 years, and whose access to court operations was established and maintained through a single point of contact. She held Seraphine's gaze across the white candle flames between them. One person, with enough proximity to the throne and enough history in this court to move documentation, access appointments, influence personnel decisions, and position military assets without triggering review. She set the requisition down flat on the table. Lady Seraphine Caldenvoss. The hall did not erupt the way the assembly had erupted 4 days ago. It went somewhere quieter and more final than eruption. It went to the specific silence of a room that had been holding its breath since the night began, and had now received the exhale it had been waiting for. Seraphine did not speak. She looked at Evelina across the table, across the pale moonfire candles, across everything that had been built between them over 11 years of a marriage and a court and a palace that they had both occupied and that only one of them had ever truly seen as the whole thing it was. She looked at Evelina with something moving in her face that was stripped of every register it had held for 11 years. No warmth, no calculation, no managed distance. Just the bare face of a woman who had built something very large and very long and had watched it come apart in a single banquet evening. Then quietly, with a control that was the last intact piece of everything she had been, she said, "You have no idea what you have done." Evelina looked at her. "Seal the doors," she said. And Rowan, standing now, his voice carrying to the guards posted at every exit of the hall, said, "Seal them." The sound of the bolts running home was the loudest sound in the room. Kavas was on his feet. The 2 generals were standing. Somewhere in the middle of the hall, a minister had pushed back from his table and was looking toward the nearest exit with the specific body language of a man calculating distances. Herath was already speaking to the palace guard captain, who had appeared at the side door. The room was full of the sound of 300 people simultaneously understanding that the banquet had become something else entirely, that the evening was not over, that whatever came next was going to be the thing that people described for the rest of their lives as the night they were in the room for. Evelina stood at the head of the table with her hands flat on the wood and the garrison requisition before her and the moonfire candles burning in the cold in the sealed hall at her back. And she looked at Seraphine, and she looked at Kavos, and she looked at the face of a plan that had been running for 2 years and had just run into the wall it had not known was there. And then the side door at the far end of the hall opened. Not the main doors. They were sealed. The side door, the passage that connected to the palace's internal servant corridors, the door that the kitchen staff used, and that everyone in this room had been inside long enough to have stopped noticing. It opened, and through it came 2 people. One was the palace guard captain, who had gone through it 60 seconds ago at Herath's direction. The other was Lyra Vale. She was not dressed as a palace guest. She was dressed in plain traveling clothes, the clothes of someone who had been somewhere else very recently and had not had time to change. Her face was the same face Evelina had seen in the dim East Wing room 3 days ago. Tired, controlled, resolved past the point of turning back. She walked into the banquet hall and she stopped when she saw the sealed doors and the standing ministers and Seraphine at the head table, and she took the full measure of the room in one sweep. Then she looked at Evelina. Evelina looked back. 300 people watched the exchange between the queen and the young woman who had been the empire's worst-kept secret for 6 weeks. The woman whose presence had been used to build the scaffold of a narrative that had nearly collapsed a queen's authority and covered a foreign operation with domestic scandal, and they watched the queen give the smallest nod, just the chin, barely a movement. And they watched the young woman's jaw set with something that was not courage exactly, but what came after courage, when the decision was already made and the body was just delivering it. Lyra Vale walked toward the head table. She walked past the sealed doors, and past the watching generals, and past Kavos, who had gone the color of old wax, and past the ministers, who were no longer looking at their hands. She walked until she was standing before the full court of Caldenmore, with the moonfire candles throwing her shadow long against the wall. She looked at Seraphine. "My name is Lyra Vale," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "And I was never the king's lover." The words landed in the hall the way a stone landed in still water. Not loud, not violent, but with the kind of displacement that moved everything outward from the point of impact and kept moving long after the stone had settled. 300 people heard Lyra Vale say it. 300 people who had spent 6 weeks receiving one version of a story: a king's mistress, a jealous queen, a court managing a domestic instability, heard the instrument of that story stand in the candlelight and take it apart with 8 words. And the silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a room doing the rapid, uncomfortable work of revision, of people looking back at what they had believed and understanding that the believing had been managed. That was the silence that cost Seraphine the most. Not the accusation, not the garrison records spread on the table, not even the sealed doors. It was the silence of 300 people revising their own judgment in real time and understanding who had shaped it and why. Seraphine sat at the head table and looked at Lyra Vale and said nothing. The nothing was the end of her. Not the arrest, which came later. Not the formal charges, which came the following morning. The nothing was the end, because Seraphine had built her entire apparatus on the architecture of narrative, on the understanding that the story people held was more powerful than the facts underneath it, and that a well-managed story, introduced at the right moment in the right room, could make the facts irrelevant. She had been right about that, in the abstract. She had been right about it in the assembly hall. She had been right about it for 11 years in this court. What she had not accounted for was a woman who had gone to a dim East Wing room alone and had offered a frightened girl with coerced handwriting and a family 60 miles away. Not a threat and not a performance, but a plain, direct transaction. I will do it, not I will try. The difference between those two statements was the difference between a promise made to manage a situation and a promise made because the person making it had decided it was the truth. Lyra Vale had been managed by careful people for 6 weeks. She had recognized the uncalculated thing when it was offered to her. The guard captain moved toward Seraphine's chair. She stood before he reached her. That was the last piece of dignity she took from the room. She stood on her own, without being hauled up, and she looked at the captain with a composure that was genuine rather than performed, because genuine composure in the worst moment was the one thing she had left and she was not going to waste it. She looked at the room. She did not look at Evelina. She walked out through the side door with the captain and 2 guards, and the sound of her footsteps on the marble was the last sound she made in the Caldon Moor court for the rest of her life. Kavos was arrested at the table. He did not stand on his own. Dolvan cooperated immediately with the flushed, rapid compliance of a man who had been calculating the moment of optimal surrender since the doors sealed, and had decided that moment was now. The 2 generals were detained at the lower table by 4 palace guards, while the room watched with the stillness of people who understood they were watching the rapid redistribution of consequence, which was a thing that, once begun, moved fast. Evelina stood at the head of the table and watched it happen. She felt the hall around her, the weight and heat of 300 people breathing the same air, and she felt something she had not expected to feel in this moment, which was not triumph and not relief, but something quieter and more specific. The particular exhaustion that came on the other side of a sustained effort, when the body finally understood that the emergency that had been keeping it functional was over and began slowly to put down what it had been carrying. She had been carrying it since the assembly hall 5 days ago. Since Verath's arrest, since the corridor at the 4th bell with Rowan's afraid face, since the garrison records and the cold water and the 90 minutes of sleep in a chair. The weight of it had been so constant that she had stopped registering it as weight and had only known it as the necessary condition of the preceding days, and now it was putting itself down without her permission, in the middle of a sealed banquet hall with 300 witnesses, and she stood very still and let it happen, because fighting it would have cost her the composure she intended to maintain until she was alone. She looked at Lyra Vale. The girl was standing where she had stopped when she finished speaking, midway between the side door and the head table, in the open space between the long rows of seated guests, with the moonfire candles throwing light across her plain traveling clothes and her tired face. She looked like what she was, a young woman who had been inside something much larger than herself for 6 weeks, and had walked out of it tonight through a door she had chosen to open herself. There was something different in her face than there had been in the East Wing room. Not happiness. Not relief exactly. The specific quality of a person who has made the hardest decision available to them and has discovered that the making of it, regardless of what follows, was the thing that mattered. Evelina crossed the distance between them. She stopped when she was close enough to speak quietly. "Your family," she said. "Where are they?" "Muriel's man brought them to Venmarch 2 days ago." Lyra's voice was steady. I got word yesterday morning. Good. Evelina held her gaze. You will have an escort to Venmarch within the week. Documents, funds, safe passage through the southern road. Whatever you need to begin somewhere else. Lyra looked at her for a moment. The same calculation she had run in the East Wing room. The real versus the managed. The promise versus the performance. You already arranged it, Lyra said, 3 days ago. Evelina held her gaze. I told you I would do it, not try. Something moved through Lyra's face. It was not gratitude, though gratitude was part of it. It was the specific expression of a person who has been operated on by people with agendas for long enough that the experience of being told the truth, and then having the truth delivered, hit like something almost painful. The recalibration of an instrument that had been tuned to expect deception. Thank you, Lyra said. 2 words. Plain, real, ill. Evelina nodded once. She turned back to the hall. The work of the night was not finished. It would not be finished for weeks. The formal charges, the depositions, the examination of the financial accounts, and the garrison records, and the full mapping of the Eastern operational network that Cassian Myral had already begun in Venmarch with the documentation Evelina had sent him. The foreign handler whose designation appeared on the staging requisition was a problem that extended beyond Caldenmoor's borders and would require the kind of extended diplomatic and intelligence work that she was already sketching the framework of in the part of her mind that never stopped moving. Ministers would be questioned, generals would be court-martialed. The Eastern Separatist Council would need to understand that the asset they had positioned inside the Caldenmoor court was gone, and that the operation they had built around its access had collapsed. And that message needed to be delivered not as a provocation, but as a closing of a chapter, because she was not interested in a border war. She was interested in a border that held. All of that was coming. All of that was the work of the months ahead. Tonight, what remained was the room. She looked at Herath, who was seated again, in the patient posture of a man who had done what he came to do and was prepared to stay as long as needed. She looked at Rowan, who was standing at the far end of the head table with his hands at his sides and his public face finally gone. Just his actual face. In the candlelight, watching the room come down from what it had been with the expression of a man who was seeing his own court clearly for the first time in longer than he wanted to calculate. She walked to him. He looked at her when she stopped beside him. Not with the assembly face, not with the managed distance. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the corridor, with the fear still present but changed in quality now. No longer the fear of a man who had just understood the shape of his failure, but the fear of a man who understood the shape of what came after it, which was harder. Understanding the failure was a single moment of reckoning. What came after was not a moment. It was a daily decision, made in the ordinary texture of a marriage and a reign, to look at things clearly and ask the right questions and not sign documents without reading them, and not let the word of one trusted voice become the substitute for his own judgment. That was not a night's work. That was the work of years. She knew this because she had watched him fail at it for 6 weeks, and before that for 12 years in smaller ways, and she had made her own failures in 12 years. The arguments she had abandoned because they exhausted her. The information she had held back because she had stopped believing he would receive it. The distance that had grown between them that she had told herself was his doing, and that was, in honest accounting, both of theirs. The grief of that was real. She had been holding it below the arithmetic of survival for 5 days, and it was still there, unchanged by the resolution of the crisis that had covered it. It was going to be there tomorrow and the day after, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. It's over, Rowan said. Not a question, not a celebration, just the naming of a fact. The immediate part, she said. The rest will take time. He looked at the room. At the ministers beginning to speak to each other in the subdued, careful way of people reassembling themselves after a structural collapse. At the empty chair where Seraphine had sat. At the moonfire candles burning down toward their holders. I have been, he started. I know what you have been, she said, not unkindly. We can talk about it, but not here and not tonight. He looked at her. Something in his face was more open than she had seen it in years. Not vulnerable in the performed way of men who wanted to be forgiven, but genuinely stripped of the layers that position and pride and 12 years of being the highest authority in every room had built around him. He was looking at his wife. Just his wife. Not the queen whose concerns were noted, not the problem to be managed, not the institutional entity that his stepmother had spent 6 weeks painting as unstable. His wife, who had read garrison records alone at the fourth bell, who had gone to an east wing room without guards, who had stood in a sealed hall in cobalt silk and taken apart a 2-year foreign operation with a requisition document and a young woman's 8 words. "I will not waste what happened here," he said. He said it the way he had said the apology in the corridor, without decoration, as a statement of fact rather than performance. "I know that is easy to say tonight. I know what it costs to believe it." She looked at him for a moment. "Then show me over the next year," she said, "and the year after that." He held her gaze. He nodded. One single, serious nod. She turned back to the hall. She looked at the room, the ministers and generals and outer province lords and noble gallery observers, all of them watching the head table with the attentiveness of people who had witnessed something that would be discussed for years in every court and dining room in the empire, and who were already constructing their own versions of what they had seen. She knew what those versions would be. She knew which details would survive the retelling and which would be smoothed over. She knew that the story of this night would be used by different people for different purposes, and that her control over the shape of it was limited. What she could control was what she did next, in the weeks ahead, in the structure of the laws she intended to propose to this court, laws governing the oversight of military deployments, the authorization chain for classified protocols, the financial review requirements for foreign-connected accounts. Specific, technical, unglamorous law. The kind that did not make for interesting retelling, but that made it significantly harder for the next Seraphine to build what this one had built inside the bones of an empire that had been too proud to imagine something like this was possible. She had learned in the last 5 days what it meant to see the full shape of a thing rather than only the part that was pointed at her. She had come into the assembly hall believing she was fighting a personal conspiracy against her authority as queen. She had ended the week understanding that her authority as queen was the smallest piece of what had been at stake, that the court she had believed she knew had been operating simultaneously as itself, and as the surface of something she had not been looking for because she had not believed it was possible. That was the thing that stayed with her. Not the garrison records, not the sealed banquet hall, not even Seraphine's face at the moment she had put the documentation face down on the table. The thing that stayed was the understanding that the most dangerous conditions were not the ones you could see and were fighting, but the ones you had stopped imagining because you had decided they weren't the problem you were facing. She would not make that mistake again. She was not sure it was a mistake a person could make twice and survive. The hall was beginning to stir in the way of a room that had received its verdict and was now beginning the process of becoming a room again. People standing, speaking in normal voices. The guards moving through the space with efficient purpose. The remaining ministers gathering in the small clusters that would become, by morning, the official account of the evening. Harith was speaking to the guard captain near the side door. The candles had burned low enough that the hall was darker than it had been at the banquet's beginning, the moonfire light reduced to a warmer, more ordinary glow. Evelina looked for Lyra Vale. The girl had moved to the edge of the room near the side passage, out of the main traffic, watching the hall with the careful sideline attention of someone who had contributed everything she came to contribute and was now waiting to understand what that contribution had cost her. Evelina crossed to her one more time. She had said what needed to be said. She had made the arrangements that needed making. There was only one more thing. "The escort will come to you in the morning," she said. "You'll be clear of the capital by midday." Lyra nodded. She looked at the room one more time, at the emptied chair, the sealed then unsealed doors, the guttering candles, the space where Seraphine had stood. She looked at it the way people looked at places they were leaving for the last time, trying to hold the shape of it against the knowledge that memory would flatten it over time into something both more and less than it actually was. "Will you be all right?" Lyra asked. She said it plainly, without the performance of concern. A genuine question from a woman who had reason to ask it. Evelina looked at her. The question, simply asked, landed somewhere underneath the composure she had maintained all evening. "Yes," she said. And then, because the girl deserved honesty more than she deserved comfort, eventually. Lyra held her gaze for a moment. She nodded. Something in her face settled. Not happiness, not relief, but the specific quality of a person who has been inside a situation that required her to be smaller than she was and who is beginning, slowly, to understand that she does not have to be that size anymore. She walked toward the side door and through it, and was gone. Evelina stood alone at the edge of the emptying hall. The guards were moving the detained ministers and generals out through the main doors, which had been unsealed now that the formal arrests were made. The outer province lords were filing out with the subdued energy of people who had been present at history and were trying to decide how they felt about it. The candles were going out one by one as the staff moved through the hall, and the room was becoming darker and quieter in increments, the ceremony of the moonfire banquet reducing itself back to stone and shadow. She stood in it and breathed. In, out. The empire was still standing. That was not a small thing. It would take months to understand the full extent of the Eastern operation's reach, to identify every compromised position, to rebuild the oversight structures that had been hollowed out over 2 years by people operating inside them. She would do that work. She was, as Arneth Kavos had once said and meant and then betrayed, a thorough woman. She would do it methodically and without the luxury of having her own authority fully restored in the court's eyes. That restoration would come over time, through the daily record of decisions made correctly, through the laws proposed and the oversight built, and the trust rebuilt in the only currency that actually held value, which was the slow accumulation of being right about things that mattered. She was not going to be loved by this court the way a simpler queen was loved. She had never been that queen, and she was less that queen now than she had ever been. What she had instead was something harder to earn and harder to take away. She had the court's wariness, which was adjacent to respect in the way that cold was adjacent to water, the same thing in a different state. She could work with that. She turned toward the door. The hall was nearly empty now, the last of the guests filtering out, the staff moving quietly through the space with their extinguishing tools. The long tables that had held 300 people an hour ago held the debris of a formal meal interrupted, wine glasses not emptied, dessert plates not cleared, the physical evidence of a room that had been occupied by something larger than its original purpose. Rowan was waiting near the main door, not blocking her path, just present in the quiet that the hall had become, with his hands at his sides and his public face still absent and his gray coat collar up against the cold that was coming in now that the doors were open. She walked toward him. She stopped when she reached him. They stood in the nearly empty hall in the diminished moonfire light, and she looked at her husband's face, the actual face, the one she had married 12 years ago and had spent 12 years knowing in every version, and she felt the shape of what they were now, which was not what they had been, and not yet what they might become. The ground between them was not restored. It had been damaged over years, and whatever Rowan had understood in the corridor at the fourth bell was not enough to rebuild it by itself. Rebuilding was different from understanding. It was slower and less dramatic, and it required a daily willingness to be present that neither of them had sustained in longer than she wanted to name. She did not know if they could. She had made no decision about it in the preceding 5 days, had not had the interior space to make that decision, had filed it in the same holding place she filed every grief that was real, but not immediately actionable. She would open that file when the work ahead allowed her to. She would look at it honestly, with the same absence of self-deception she had brought to the garrison records, and the East Wing room, and the sealed banquet hall. She would decide then. "Come on," she said. Her voice was quiet in the empty hall. They walked out together into the corridor, the Imperial guards falling in behind them at the appropriate distance, the palace closing around them in its nighttime configuration. Cold stone, low lamps, the sound of their footsteps moving in a pattern that 12 years of the same corridors had made into something close to instinct. The capital outside the palace walls was dark and cold and going about its ordinary midnight business. The last traders closing their stalls in the lower market, the overnight watchmen on the bridge, the particular dense silence of a city that was sleeping while the mechanisms of power moved above it, in ways it would not fully understand until morning brought the reports and the official accounts and the version of events that would become, over time, the story the Empire told itself about this week. She would not control that story. She had never controlled it. What she could control was what she did inside it, which was what she had always controlled, and which was enough. Months passed, not quickly, not painlessly. The investigation into the Eastern operation was long and detailed and produced findings that required 3 separate ministerial commissions to process, which she oversaw personally, sitting through sessions that lasted past midnight, and through depositions that covered material she had first read in a cold room at the fourth bell, and that now filled 40 official volumes in the Imperial Archive. The foreign handler was identified, through Mural's intelligence work, and through the documentation recovered from Kavos's private records after his arrest, as an agent of the Eastern Separatist Council who had been operating through the Valdres Merchant House for 3 years. The council, confronted with the evidence and with the failure of their asset, chose the path of formal negotiation, which was what she had believed they would choose and had built toward from the beginning, because the Eastern Separatists were not suicidal. They were opportunistic, and the opportunity had closed. Kavos was convicted on 3 counts of unauthorized military authorization and 2 counts of financial fraud. Dolvain received reduced charges in exchange for his full cooperation. The 2 Eastern generals were court-martialed. Lord Perrin was removed from office and his assets reviewed. 7 other ministers were formally censured, their involvement ranging from willful participation to the kind of deliberate not-looking that was its own form of betrayal, and that she intended the new oversight laws to make significantly more expensive going forward. Verith was released. His record was cleared. He came to her the morning after his release with a face that had aged in captivity in the specific way of proud men who have been reduced, and he stood in her receiving room and did not know what to say, and she let him not say it, because some things were better left in the space between people who understood each other without requiring the words to be said. The laws passed. Not all of them. 3 were modified by the ministers, 2 were rejected and required resubmission with amendments. 1 was held in committee for 6 months before she found the combination of pressure and compromise that moved it through. This was the unglamorous part, the part that no one would remember in the version of events that survived the years, but that mattered most because the drama of a sealed banquet hall could be revisited only in memory, while the law lived in the daily operations of an empire and protected people who would never know they had needed protection. Seraphine was sentenced to permanent exile. The sentencing session was quiet, not because the verdict was gentle, but because by the time it arrived, there was nothing left to argue. She was transported to the northern border province of Aldenmere, a cold and modest region far from every court she had ever operated in, and she lived there in a house that was comfortable by the standards of the place, and that was, by every other standard she had held for 11 years, the end of her world. Evelina did not attend the sentencing. She had said what needed to be said in the banquet hall, and she had no interest in watching an old woman's world end. She had been the instrument of that ending, and she would carry the weight of it with the same honesty she carried everything else, which meant acknowledging that it had been necessary, and that necessary things still had weight, and that the weight did not diminish because the necessity was real. She had learned in the preceding months that the measure of what she had done was not how it felt to have done it, but what it had prevented. The Eastern operation, fully mapped in the commission reports, had been designed to trigger a succession crisis during the banquet night, a domestic scandal that fractured the court, a king isolated from his queen, ministers bought and positioned, military assets staged for rapid movement into disputed territory under cover of the empire's internal chaos. It was not a plan designed to destroy Caldon Moor. It was a plan designed to use Caldon Moor's own structure against itself, to turn its ceremonies and its gossip and its hierarchy of witnesses into the machinery of its own vulnerability. She had interrupted that machinery. She had done it with garrison records and a sealed letter and a plain transaction in a dim room, and the patience to let the real shape of a thing become visible rather than fighting the surface she had first been shown. That was not heroism. She had no interest in calling it that. It was competence, applied under conditions designed to make competence impossible, which was the only definition of the word she had ever found worth using. In the spring of the following year, Lyra Vale sent a letter from Venmarch. It was brief, and it was written in a hand that was more confident than the hand that had written the coerced words of a document designed to be used against someone else. She had found work in a trading house. Her mother was well. Her brother had apprenticed to a glassmaker. She did not ask for anything. She wrote only to say that she was there, and that she was all right, and that she had not forgotten. Evelina read it once, then set it in the document box she kept in her private chamber, the one that held the things she did not file officially because they were not official in nature, but that she intended to keep because they were true. The year moved towards summer. The court settled into the particular rhythm of an institution that had been disrupted and was rebuilding its internal confidence, which was a slow process and a necessary one, and she did not rush it. She sat through assembly sessions and reviewed treasury reports and met with the border province governors, and did the daily work of governance that was not interesting and was entirely the point. The work did not look like what she had done in the banquet hall. It did not feel like it. It was quieter and longer and less visible, and it was where the real difference between a reign and a reign worth having was made. She and Rowan moved toward each other slowly. There was no single moment of restoration, no scene that resolved what had accumulated over 12 years plus 6 weeks, plus the specific damage of a man who had let himself be managed into complicity with his wife's destruction. There were instead many small moments, unremarkable individually. A conversation after a late session, the sharing of a meal that turned into something longer than a meal. The morning she showed him the Eastern Commission reports, and he read them himself, every page, and asked the right questions. And she saw in his face the genuine understanding that he had been the largest hole in his own defenses, the trusting nature that had been a strength for so long that he had stopped being able to see it as a vulnerability. He changed. Not completely. She was not interested in complete, which was a fiction. He changed in the ways that were possible for a man of 38 who had operated as a king since he was 26 and had to relearn the habit of looking clearly at things he trusted. That change was real, and she received it as real, without requiring it to be more than it was. There was a morning in late summer when she stood at the window of her private chamber, the one that looked over the inner courtyard, and the courtyard was alive with the ordinary morning movement of the palace: stable hands, kitchen staff, a dog crossing the far corner, the low sounds of an institution going about its daily functions. And she stood and looked at it and felt something she had not felt in long enough that it took her a moment to name it. She felt the weight of her hands at her sides. Not heavy, just present. The particular awareness of a body that had been carrying something for a long time and had set it down and was learning to walk in the new configuration of its own weight. Not peace. She was too clear-eyed for peace as a permanent condition. But the thing that came in the intervals between crises, when the work was sustaining rather than urgent, and the people around her could be trusted rather than mapped for threat. The thing that came when a human being had done what needed doing and was still standing afterward, changed by it, not destroyed by it. That was enough. It was more than enough. In an empire, on a throne, in a marriage that was a work in progress rather than a finished thing, that was everything. She stood at the window until the morning finished arriving, and then she turned back to the desk and the day's documents and the steady, ongoing, unglamorous labor of keeping an empire intact. And she began.